A waitress helped a poor man pay for his meal. She never imagined who he really was. Years later, he returns as a millionaire with an unbelievable surprise. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Susan Green woke before dawn every day, her alarm clock buzzing with a soft chime that reminded her it was time to head out into the chilly streets of Winchester, Virginia. At 25, she had grown used to the routine. Rise early, prepare a quick breakfast for her mother, and then make her way to the Sunrise Café for the morning shift. The Café, a small establishment off North Loudoun Street, had become a home away from home for Susan, a place where she could momentarily forget the burdens of life waiting for her back at the modest green cottage she shared with her mother. That morning, she carefully gathered her blonde hair into a loose ponytail, catching a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Dark smudges under her eyes hinted at yet another late night of balancing the household budget and worrying about her mother's medical bills. She tried to smile at her reflection, assuring herself that a warm demeanor made all the difference to the customers she served. The reflection smiled back in a tentative way, a reminder that she was more hopeful than she sometimes felt. Upon arriving at the Sunrise Café, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and buttery pastries greeted her. It was a simple place, with sturdy wooden chairs and tables that had seen better days. Photographs of local landmarks, like the Shenandoah Valley and the historical downtown, adorned the walls. Betty Crawford, the cafe's original owner, had decorated it with a sense of community and warmth, though she was often away visiting relatives or traveling. In her absence, the day-to-day operations fell to Norman Miller, the stiff and methodical manager who believed that profit margins came before sentiment. "Susan, you're right on time," Norman remarked, barely glancing up from the ledger he clutched. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, with thin hair combed carefully to the side. His eyes were perpetually narrowed, as though he were constantly recalculating expenses in his mind. "We've already got a couple of regulars in. Make sure to push the new breakfast special." "Yes, Mr. Miller," she replied, slipping on her apron. The cafe was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the ceiling fans and the low murmur of conversation at a corner table. She recognized Mrs. Robinson, an elderly widow who always came in at sunrise for her cup of decaf and a buttered croissant. Susan greeted her with a warm smile, took her order, and offered a listening ear to any stories Mrs. Robinson wanted to share. In between taking orders and fetching refills, Susan would steal glances out the large front windows that offered a view of the street. She caught sight of people rushing to work, mothers hurrying their children into school buses, and even the occasional jogger braving the crisp morning air. It was a snapshot of life carrying on, each person with their own responsibilities and dreams. Sometimes, Susan longed to be one of those passers-by, free to chase whatever aspirations she might have. Instead, her life was bound to the cafe and the reality of caring for her mother, Catherine Green. Catherine, only 52, had faced a series of health challenges after her husband, Susan's father, had passed away from a sudden heart attack years before. Mounting medical bills weighed heavily on them. Susan often felt torn between wanting to pursue her own passions and ensuring her mother's well-being. Nevertheless, she had no regrets about devoting herself to her mother's care. Kindness, she believed, was never wasted. Around mid-morning, Hannah Thompson bustled through the door, her curly brown hair falling in a loose bob around her shoulders. She worked the later shift and had become one of Susan's closest friends. Balancing motherhood of two young twins at home, Hannah understood Susan's struggle with responsibility. "Morning, sunshine," Hannah greeted, slipping into the staff area with a friendly wink. "Any excitement so far?" Susan shook her head, a gentle laugh escaping her lips. Same old Mrs. Robinson and her stories. Norman lecturing me about the correct way to stack pastries in the display case. Hannah grinned. Don't let him get to you. You know he's just obsessed with order. Sooner or later, Betty will be back and things will feel a bit more normal. Before Susan could respond, the bell over the entrance jingled, drawing her attention to the front door. Through the window, she could see a figure pause briefly before stepping inside. It was a young man, thin and clearly exhausted, with ragged clothes that had seen far too many chilly nights. His hair stuck out in uneven tufts, and he hesitated, as though unsure if he was allowed to enter. Susan felt a wave of compassion when she met his gaze. She'd seen homelessness before, but there was something about this man's expression, some mix of desperation and gratitude that made her heart tighten. She watched as he nervously approached the counter, clearing his throat to get her attention. The lines etched into his face hinted at long days of hunger and worry. Despite the urge to ask if he needed help, Susan waited to see what he might say. The man's voice, soft and trembling, reached her ears. "Excuse me, can I just get a glass of water?" His request was so modest, so utterly devoid of presumption, that Susan felt her chest constrict. She saw Norman glance over disapprovingly, no doubt ready to tell the man they weren't a shelter. But something within Susan urged her to take action, not in pity, but in empathy. Without breaking eye contact, she opened her mouth to speak, already deciding that a simple glass of water would not be enough for someone who appeared on the brink of collapse. Later that same morning, Susan found herself setting a bowl of steaming soup in front of the stranger, even though he had only asked for water. The cafe was busier now, with new customers arriving for an early lunch, so she kept her voice low as she leaned in to speak to him. "It's on me," she whispered, offering him a sympathetic smile. "You look like you could use a warm meal." The man, clearly surprised, hesitated before thanking her in an almost inaudible voice. His hands shook as he picked up the spoon, and Susan realized just how hungry he must have been. She felt the weight of disapproval from Norman's glance across the room, but she tried not to let it bother her. Deep down, she believed no one should be turned away when in need, and she could manage the cost of one meal on her own if necessary. When the man finally spoke, his words were shaky. "My name's Aaron, by the way," he said, barely above a whisper. "Susan," she replied, offering another reassuring smile. "If you need anything else, just let me know." She left him to eat in peace, aware that her gesture might stir up some tension with Norman. A few minutes later, as she was pouring coffee for Mrs. Robinson, Norman caught Susan's attention from behind the counter. His expression was as rigid as ever, and she braced herself for his reprimand. "Are you planning to pay for that out of your wages?" he asked, voice curt. "We can't feed every wanderer who walks in off the street." Susan drew a slow breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I'll cover the cost, Mr. Miller. It's just one bowl of soup." "I don't mind." He eyed her suspiciously, as if suspecting some hidden motive, then gave a short nod. "Just make sure you don't make a habit of it." She watched Norman walk away, shoulders stiff with disapproval. Anxiety churned in her stomach. But she stood firm in her decision, beneath all her financial worries and the health issues her mother faced. Susan's heart still guided her to be compassionate. One meal wouldn't break her budget completely, though she'd have to be careful not to make it a regular occurrence. Even so, something about Aaron's quiet demeanor lingered with her, a nagging feeling that told her she'd done the right thing. Hannah noticed Susan's subdued expression and made her way over to the counter. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. Susan glanced over at Aaron, who was finishing his soup and staring down at the empty bowl with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I just helped someone who's struggling, that's all," she explained. "Norman isn't thrilled about it, but I'll pay for it myself." Hannah placed a comforting hand on Susan's arm. "You've always had the biggest heart. Norman can't take that away from you. Goodness knows if more people acted like you, the world would be a kinder place." Susan appreciated the support, but she also wondered how her mother would feel if she found out that a few of those precious dollars went to someone else's meal instead of household bills. Catherine was a practical woman, shaped by years of hardship and too many medical visits. Susan could already hear her mother's mild scolding. "You need to think about your own future, Susan. We can't afford handouts." Shortly afterward, Aaron stood up, clutching a worn backpack. He stepped toward the cash register, fishing in his pockets for what Susan guessed might be loose change or simply lint. His cheeks reddened when he realized he was offering her nothing. I can't pay you back right now," he stammered, "but I promise I'll find a way." Susan rested a gentle hand on the counter. "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm just glad you had something to eat. Take care of yourself, okay?" There was a flicker in his eyes, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. He settled on a slight nod, muttered a quiet "thank you," and slipped out of the cafe. Susan watched him leave, a strange sensation tugging at her chest. She felt certain she had seen those eyes somewhere before, although her mind couldn't quite place the memory. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of orders and checkouts. Around noon, the cafe became crowded with employees from nearby offices, which gave Susan little time to dwell on Aaron's visit. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. Something about his gentle voice and the gratitude shimmering in his gaze clung to her mind. She brushed it off as nothing more than empathy for a stranger in need. Even as she wiped down tables and prepared the cafe for the next wave of customers, Susan couldn't shake the sense that this small gesture might one day have far-reaching consequences. She glanced through the window, imagining Aaron's figure vanishing into the bustle of Winchester. There was a stirring in her heart, an inkling that fate had just nudged her onto a path she didn't yet comprehend. That evening, Susan walked home beneath a sky awash with hues of orange and pink, the lingering warmth of sunset stretching across the quiet streets of Winchester. She carried a small paper bag of groceries and a head full of worries. Thoughts of Aaron and the gentle look in his eyes wouldn't leave her mind. She attempted to rationalize the encounter. Homeless people came and went. She'd simply helped someone. But something tugged at her memory, as if demanding she piece together a puzzle. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. When she reached the small green cottage she shared with her mother, Susan paused by the porch. Soft light glowed from the living room window, where she could see Catherine's silhouette. Letting out a calming breath, Susan opened the front door to find her mother seated on the couch, wrapped in a warm quilt. A cough rattled Catherine's chest, and she briefly pressed a hand to her heart, as though to steady its beat. "How was work, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her daughter. "Busy as always," Susan replied, trying to sound cheerful. She set the groceries on the counter and pulled off her coat. "They had a new lunch special. I might have to try recreating it at home sometime." Catherine attempted a smile, but seemed too tired to keep it up for long. Susan noticed the pallor in her mother's face. It was a reminder that the medical bills piling up on the kitchen table weren't just numbers. They represented urgent care that Catherine needed. Guilt poked at Susan's conscience, recalling she'd paid for a stranger's meal that morning. "Are you feeling all right, Mom?" Susan asked softly. Moving to sit beside her, Catherine patted her daughter's hand. "I'm fine, just a little tired. These new medications make me drowsy." Susan squeezed her mother's hand, then stood to tidy the bills lying scattered on the coffee table. She recognized the letterhead of the local hospital on one envelope. Her shoulders tensed. "We'll manage," she murmured more to herself than to Catherine, though her voice lacked conviction. Once her mother was settled in for the evening, Susan slipped into the small bedroom that was hers, though it still held remnants of childhood. Hand-drawn pictures tacked to the walls and a bookshelf filled with old fairy tales. She sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the moment when Aaron had introduced himself at the cafe. That name, it sounded so familiar. She recalled an Aaron from her childhood, a boy with bright eyes and a mischievous grin who lived 2 houses away. They used to play in the backyard, inventing all sorts of adventures, pretending to run their own little bakery from a cardboard box, using imaginary money to buy pastries drawn on scraps of paper. The memory was hazy, overshadowed by the day his family abruptly moved away. She wondered if the man at the cafe could be the same Aaron Parker. Shaking her head, she slipped into her pajamas and decided there was no point in speculating. Childhood was a lifetime ago, and it was unlikely fate would have brought the same Aaron back in such circumstances. Still, her chest tightened with a peculiar longing to know what had happened to that boy she once knew. If only she could remember his last name without rummaging through old diaries or photo albums. After a restless night, Susan returned to work the next morning, trying to suppress her curiosity. The morning crowd trickled in, seeking their daily caffeine fix. Hannah arrived soon after, greeting Susan with a broad smile. "You look like you barely slept," Hannah remarked gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Is everything okay?" Susan hesitated. "I can't stop thinking about that man from yesterday, Aaron. I know it sounds odd, but the name is familiar." "It's like I've heard it 1,000 times before." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "An old flame, maybe," she teased, then quickly added, "Sorry, just kidding. But seriously, if it's on your mind, maybe it's a sign. Have you tried looking at any old photos?" A faint laugh escaped Susan. "I guess I should. My childhood keeps creeping back into my thoughts, even though I can't pin down why." Before she could elaborate, Norman strode in carrying a clipboard, already barking instructions about restocking supplies. Hannah rolled her eyes playfully behind his back, lightening the mood. The day slipped into its usual pattern, taking orders, greeting regulars, wiping down tables. Yet Susan's mind was far from routine. Whenever the door opened, her gaze flickered toward it, half expecting to see Aaron again. He never showed. Hours later, when Susan finally got a break, she retrieved her phone from her apron. A fleeting thought made her search social media for the name Aaron Parker. Unsure if that was even the right last name, the search yielded countless Aarons, none of them recognizable as the thin man she had fed the day before. Sighing, she tucked the phone away. She felt a strange ache, almost like missing someone she wasn't sure she even knew. As she returned to work, she spotted something in the back corner of the cafe, a discarded photograph featuring employees and customers from a community event 2 summers ago. Holding it closer, she noted that it was nothing more than a group picture, yet the sight of old snapshots rekindled her determination to sort through her own boxes of memories at home. If the man she helped truly was her childhood friend, she needed proof. Even if he wasn't the same Aaron, maybe some piece of her past would clarify why she felt so strongly connected to him. By the end of that week, the sunny weather gave way to cool, overcast skies that seemed to echo Susan's inner state. She had spent an evening rummaging through an old shoebox of photographs, but found nothing conclusive about Aaron or his family. A handful of pictures showed a boy named Aaron she once knew, but his face was different from the gaunt man who appeared at the cafe. Or maybe time had simply erased the resemblance. Regardless, the question lingered as Susan navigated her shift at the Sunrise Cafe. She tried to focus on taking orders for coffee and warm sandwiches. Norman's mood was as grey as the weather, and every so often he would mention their tight margins, hinting that free meals shouldn't become a habit. Susan nodded politely, swallowing her urge to defend her choice. She wondered if she would do it again. Her heart said yes, though her rational mind, pressed by financial worries, gave her pause. Late that afternoon, a familiar ring came from her phone while she was in the back room, wiping down cups. Concerned it might be the hospital calling, she quickly answered, "Hello. Susan, it's Dr. Manning from Winchester Medical." The voice on the line was calm but direct. "I'm calling about your mother's recent test results." Susan set the cup down and grasped the phone more tightly. "Yes, doctor, please go on." "There's been a slight decline in her heart function," Dr. Manning continued. "It's not an emergency, but we do recommend she come in for additional testing. Depending on those results, we might discuss more aggressive treatments. I'm sure you're aware that could be costly, especially if surgery is required." She thanked him, her mouth dry, then ended the call. The tension in her chest felt crushing. Catherine already struggled day to day, and the idea of another expensive procedure loomed like a thundercloud. Susan thought of all the late bills and the shoestring budget she'd balanced for months. A wave of guilt crashed over her. Why had she spent even a small amount on a stranger's meal? Frustrated and scared, Susan stepped out of the back room and returned to the main floor, where Hannah noticed her anxious expression. "Hey, you look pale. Is everything okay?" Hannah asked, concern evident in her tone. Susan shook her head, fighting the sting of tears. "I just got a call from my mom's doctor. More tests. Possible surgery." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not sure how to pay for all of this." Hannah's eyes softened. "I'm so sorry. Listen, I know how it feels when money's tight, especially with medical bills. If you need an extra shift or two, I can try to juggle something with Norman." "Thanks," Susan said quietly. "I might take you up on that." When her shift ended, she hurried home to find Catherine in her favorite armchair, reading an old cookbook. Her mother looked up and noticed Susan's troubled expression. "Susan, come here," she said gently, setting the book aside. "You got another call from the doctor, didn't you? I can see it all over your face." Susan knelt beside the armchair, resting her head on Catherine's lap. "They want to run more tests, maybe schedule surgery if it's bad." Her voice wavered. "How are we going to afford it?" Catherine smoothed Susan's hair, her own worries shining in her eyes. "We'll manage, like we always do," she whispered. "I'm sorry I'm such a burden on you." "Don't say that," Susan sniffed, pulling back to look at her mother. "I just wish I could do more." Catherine tried to smile. "Maybe it's time for you to think bigger, Susan. You've always talked about wanting your own cafe. I worry that you're stifling your own dreams because of me." Before Susan could protest, a coughing fit seized Catherine, and she reached for the glass of water on the side table. Susan gently rubbed her mother's back, her heart pounding with concern. The coughing subsided, leaving Catherine visibly drained. When she finally caught her breath, she waved a hand dismissively. "I'm fine, don't worry. But promise me you won't let everything pass you by." Susan swallowed hard, remembering how many times she had fantasized about running her own cozy coffee shop. It felt out of reach, especially now with her mounting responsibilities. She wondered if she'd spend her entire life serving at someone else's cafe, handing out kindness whenever she could, only to leave her own aspirations behind. After preparing a simple dinner of chicken broth and crackers, Susan helped her mother upstairs to bed, the gravity of the doctor's phone call weighing heavily on both of them. As she tucked her in, Catherine touched Susan's cheek, her voice tinged with sadness. "I see your father in you. He was always so determined to help everyone." Susan forced a small, reassuring smile. "He taught me well." Yet deep inside, fear rippled through her. How could she remain true to her generous spirit and also protect her mother? Was her compassion a blessing or a curse when money was scarce? She thought of Aaron again, recalling the hollow look in his eyes. A fleeting pang of regret hit her. Maybe she had been too careless with her limited resources. But no matter how she tried, she couldn't fully regret showing him kindness. It was part of who she was. Over the weekend, Susan worked extra hours, hoping to cover a portion of her mother's upcoming medical expenses. The cafe was bustling with tourists visiting Winchester's historic sites. Although the tips were decent, her exhaustion was almost unbearable. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting Aaron to walk in again. Each time it opened, she caught her breath, feeling a peculiar combination of eagerness and dread. But he never showed. On Sunday afternoon, after the final rush had trickled out, Hannah helped Susan close up. They took turns wiping down tables and restocking supplies. The warm light of late afternoon streamed in through the windows, illuminating specks of dust dancing in the air. Hannah placed a comforting hand on Susan's shoulder. "Still thinking about Aaron?" she asked gently. "I noticed you checking the door all day." Susan laughed softly, tired lines appearing around her eyes. "It's silly, I know. We cross paths with strangers every day, but this one felt different." Hannah shrugged. "Nothing silly about it. Sometimes it takes just one encounter to change everything. Who knows? Maybe you'll see him again." Susan wanted to say more, but the sudden reappearance of Norman interrupted them. "Ladies, before you wrap up, do a final count of the register," he instructed, his tone as businesslike as ever. "And Susan, make sure we didn't lose anything from the freebies earlier this week." She nodded, biting back any sarcastic remark. After Norman left, she locked the doors and pulled out the battered old cash register's drawer. Together with Hannah, she recounted the day's sales. Despite her lingering worries, the numbers were actually decent. Once they finished, Hannah turned to her. "Are you heading straight home?" Susan hesitated. "I thought I might drop by the library. I want to see if they have old phone directories or local articles that might reference someone named Aaron Parker." "That's assuming Parker is his last name, of course." Hannah nodded with a thoughtful expression. "You're really determined." "I just have this feeling," Susan admitted, averting her gaze. "I remember playing with a boy named Aaron as a kid. We pretended we ran a little bakery in my backyard. We'd always say we'd open a real cafe one day. It's been years, but I can't shake the thought it might be him." Hannah's face softened. "You never told me that part. It's no wonder this is on your mind." They said their goodbyes, and Susan made her way to the small public library just a few blocks from the cafe. It was a quaint brick building, its wooden doors creaking when she entered. The librarian, an older woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, smiled in welcome. Susan explained she was looking for old city records or phone books from around 15 to 20 years ago. The librarian guided her to a corner where dusty volumes and microfilm reels were neatly arranged. For nearly an hour, Susan flipped through indexes of names, occasionally checking cross-references. She found a Parker family from many years back, but they'd apparently moved away after a foreclosure. The father's name seemed familiar, Richard Parker, and that triggered a faint memory. She could almost picture the father, a kind man who'd once complimented her for sharing crayons with Aaron. Her pulse quickened as she read a short blurb about the foreclosure. The Parker family had left town suddenly, facing financial ruin. Then there was a reference to the mother filing for bankruptcy. Susan felt the pang of sorrow that accompanied thoughts of what that family must have gone through. Though she didn't find any current information about Aaron Parker's whereabouts, a small hope took root in her heart. The dates and the name matched what she remembered from childhood. It seemed possible that the thin, ragged man she'd helped truly was her old friend. Why he was back in Winchester, alone and hungry, was another mystery altogether. When she got home, it was well past dinner time. She found her mother napping on the couch, the television flickering silently. Susan tiptoed to the kitchen, made herself a quick sandwich, and settled at the table to think. She glanced at a framed photograph on the windowsill, a picture of her as a little girl with a broad grin, her father standing proudly behind her. It reminded her of simpler times, moments when dreams felt within reach. She remembered how, in that snapshot, she'd been wearing a playful apron, talking about owning a cafe one day. Her father had encouraged every one of her dreams. A nostalgic ache filled her chest. Maybe Catherine was right. Maybe it was time to push beyond simply getting by and pursue something bolder. Yet fear of failing her mother, both financially and emotionally, weighed heavily on her. Just then, Catherine stirred from her nap, her eyes fluttering open. She noticed Susan at the kitchen table and asked in a voice thick with drowsiness, "Why are you up so late, sweetie?" Susan paused, uncertain how much to reveal. Ultimately, she offered a small, hopeful smile. "Just thinking about what could be next. Something tells me life might be about to change." She wasn't sure why she said it out loud, but she realized she meant it more than ever. Despite the doubts, a spark of possibility glimmered, as though the universe was nudging her toward a future she couldn't yet define. A few days after her late-night search at the library, Susan arrived at the Sunrise Café to start the morning shift, her mind still preoccupied with questions about Aaron Parker. The air outside was crisp, and light drizzle tapped against the windows as she slipped off her rain jacket. Inside, the cafe already buzzed with activity, regulars hunched over steaming coffee cups, and a pair of tourists from out of town studied the menu by the pastry case. Hannah caught sight of Susan and hurried over. "Guess who's back in town?" she whispered excitedly, leaning in. "Betty Crawford. She showed up about 20 minutes ago." Susan's eyes widened. Betty was the cafe's original owner, a woman known for her warmth and resilience. Susan had always admired Betty's ability to stay positive, even through personal hardships. She'd been traveling for several months, visiting family across the country. Now she was back, and Susan felt a surge of relief, as though a pillar of support had returned at exactly the right time. Before she could respond, Betty appeared from the office area, her grey hair pulled into a neat bun. She was in her early 60s, with a strong frame and an air of determination that always gave Susan courage. Betty swept Susan into a warm hug, the scent of vanilla perfume clinging to her sweater. "Susan, darling, it's so good to see you." Her voice was bright, yet her discerning gaze caught the tension etched around Susan's eyes. "Tell me how you've been, honey." "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Susan managed a small smile, not wanting to spill all her troubles in front of the customers. She gestured toward an empty table in a corner. "Let's catch up over there. I'd love to hear about your trip." They sat down, and Betty reached across, taking Susan's hand in hers. "You first," she insisted gently. "I can see there's something pressing on your mind." Glancing around the cafe to ensure Norman wasn't about to interrupt, Susan lowered her voice. She spoke of her mother's health scare, the mounting bills, and the moment she helped a man named Aaron who might be her childhood friend. She mentioned the sense of longing she felt and her lingering questions about who he truly was. Betty listened intently, her eyes thoughtful. "Susan, kindness is never wasted," she said softly. "I'm proud of you for offering that man a meal. Sometimes it just takes one gesture to change the course of someone's life." Susan's shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's not just about money, though. I'm worried about my mom. I'm worried about whether I'll ever do more than just serve tables here. I can't shake the feeling that my life is meant for something else, like opening my own cafe, just like I dreamed when I was little." Betty smiled, but there was a resolute seriousness in her gaze. "That dream is still alive inside you, Susan. It's plain as day. It might be challenging with everything you have on your plate, but challenges are what shape us." She gave a gentle squeeze to Susan's hand. I never told many people this, but when I first started the Sunrise Café, I nearly lost it within a year. Bills piled up. I was afraid and exhausted. But a small group of kind souls stepped in. They believed in me when I struggled to believe in myself. Susan tilted her head. Curiosity piqued. You never mentioned that before. Betty shrugged good-naturedly. I suppose I didn't want to burden you with the mistakes of my past. But I share it now because maybe it'll encourage you. Don't be afraid to accept help when it's given genuinely. Whether it's a stranger or an old friend from childhood, you can't always do things alone. Susan felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed in public. She wanted to confide in Betty about the possibility that Aaron might have returned to Winchester under dire circumstances, but she feared seeming foolish. Still, Betty's words resonated deeply. Opening up to the right people could lead her to the next step in her life. Just then, Norman appeared at the table, clearing his throat. Betty, good to have you back, he said with a respectful nod. Susan, could you restock the front pastry case? We're running low on muffins. Susan glanced at Betty apologetically, and Betty shooed her away with a wave of the hand. Go on, we'll talk more later. For the rest of the morning, she moved behind the counter, feeling a strange mixture of reassurance and impatience. Betty was back, and with her came a renewed sense of possibility. As Susan refilled mugs and handed out baked goods, she mulled over their conversation. If Betty had persevered through her own financial nightmares, perhaps Susan could too. Yet she still needed a plan, and more than that, a spark of confidence that she could follow through. Shortly before noon, Betty prepared to leave but stopped by the register where Susan stood. I'd love to share more about my early days, she said in a low voice. Come by my place tonight if you have time. We can make some tea and talk. Susan nodded, gratitude flooding her. I'll be there, she promised, already sensing that Betty might be the key to unlocking a bolder future. That evening, Susan arrived at Betty's cozy bungalow, a place filled with comfortable old furniture and the aroma of cinnamon potpourri. A gentle rain pattered against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop. Betty welcomed her with a wide smile, guiding her into the living room where a fire crackled in the old brick hearth. After pouring 2 cups of chamomile tea, Betty sat across from Susan on a well-worn sofa, its floral pattern faded by years of use. Outside, the storm picked up, but the glow from the fireplace gave the small room a sense of warmth and refuge. I'm so glad you came, Betty began, tucking one foot beneath her. I've been wanting to share a bit of my story and maybe help you figure out the next step. Susan sipped her tea, nodding. I'm listening. Betty leaned forward, elbows on her knees. When I first opened the Sunrise Café, I was running from a failed business up north. I had little money, no savings to speak of. There were days I barely covered rent, but I had a knack for baking and a love for serving people. Slowly, I built up a base of loyal customers, and then something wonderful happened. I let others help. Sometimes they offered financial backing. Other times they simply gave moral support or volunteered labor. Susan thought of her own situation, barely making ends meet, faced with her mother's medical needs. The idea of letting someone invest in her dream seemed both tempting and terrifying. How did you know who to trust? She asked. With a soft chuckle, Betty replied, I didn't always, to be honest. I made mistakes, trusted a few folks who turned out to have ulterior motives, but in the end, I discovered I wasn't meant to do it all by myself. Pride and fear almost held me back. It was the warmth and generosity of others that truly carried me. A flicker of emotion crossed Susan's face. I've always prided myself on being self-sufficient, especially since Dad died. My mother, she worries about losing what little we have. I can't blame her. We've struggled for so long." Betty's gaze was filled with understanding. "I know. But you can't let fear be the only deciding factor in your life. Dreams thrive on a balance of caution and courage." They talked well into the evening, delving into financial planning, business strategies, and the emotional fortitude it would take for Susan to leave her comfort zone. Betty even scribbled down a few rough sketches of how the Sunrise Café had expanded over the years, where she sourced supplies, how she managed seasonal changes in revenue, ways to keep costs low while still investing in quality. Eventually, the conversation shifted to Aaron, and Susan explained her hunch about him possibly being the boy she once played with. She felt a little self-conscious, admitting she'd almost embarked on a personal quest to find him. Betty listened without judgment, occasionally nodding in sympathy. "It sounds like he made quite an impression on you," Betty observed gently. "Maybe there's a reason your paths crossed again." Susan shrugged, fiddling with the edges of the napkin in her lap. "I don't know. He showed up hungry. I helped, and then he vanished. Part of me wants to see him again, if only to be sure he's all right." She hesitated, her voice growing softer. "Another part of me wonders if he's connected to my dreams somehow." Betty smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Life has a funny way of weaving destinies together. If he's meant to be part of your story, he'll show up again." Before Susan left that night, Betty walked her to the door and gave her a tight hug. "Remember, child, sometimes you have to step away from everything safe and known in order to truly pursue what you love. Don't be afraid to let go of that old routine if it means stepping into something bigger." Driving home, Susan felt a curious mix of apprehension and excitement. Betty's words lingered like a gentle refrain in her mind. Don't be afraid. She realized she might need to take a leap of faith sooner than later. Perhaps that meant exploring how to open her own cafe, or even making room in her heart for someone like Aaron Parker, a living reminder that second chances exist. When she got home, Catherine was asleep, and the house was still. Susan tiptoed upstairs and paused by her mother's bedroom, listening for her steady breathing. Knowing her mother was resting comfortably eased a bit of the weight on Susan's heart. In her own room, she dug through a stack of notebooks until she found an old blank journal. Sitting at her desk, she opened it to the first page and wrote at the top, "My plans for a future cafe." It felt bold, maybe too bold, but also exhilarating. In that moment, she recognized that stepping away from the familiar might be the only way she could ever truly stand on her own. The following week, Susan took small but meaningful steps outside her usual comfort zone. Inspired by her talk with Betty, she began researching potential properties for rent in Winchester, scanning online listings and local notices. She had no illusions about her finances. She was aware she didn't have nearly enough saved for a big move. Still, it didn't cost anything to look, to dream, and maybe even to plan for a future she'd long suppressed. One sunny afternoon, she arranged to view a vacant storefront near the edge of the downtown area. The glass doors were streaked with dust, and the "For Rent" sign hung crookedly. A middle-aged realtor met her on the sidewalk, jangling the keys with a polite smile. Susan's heart pounded as she stepped inside the large, empty space. She wandered around quietly, picturing a warm, welcoming interior, comfortable chairs, and a pastry display brimming with treats. Wooden shelves displaying specialty coffee beans lined the walls in her imagination. She could almost hear the hum of conversation and the aroma of fresh bread enveloping the air. The place was far from perfect. It needed new paint, maybe even new plumbing. But for Susan, it held the magic of possibility. When she asked the realtor about monthly rent, her stomach sank. It was more than she earned in a month at Sunrise Café. Still, she thanked him for his time, leaving with a bittersweet mix of excitement and dismay. As she walked back toward the main street, she felt as if she'd stepped into an alternate universe. She realized how large the gap was between her dream and her bank account, yet she couldn't deny the spark it kindled within her. That evening at home, she found Catherine resting in the living room with the television on low volume. Susan settled beside her and mustered the courage to mention the possibility of looking for her own place to start a cafe. "Mom, I've been thinking about my future," she ventured carefully. Catherine turned her head, giving Susan a questioning look. "Oh, did something happen at the Sunrise Café?" Susan shook her head. "No, it's not that. But Betty is back, and she's been encouraging me to think bigger." She spoke haltingly, trying to gauge her mother's reaction. "I even visited a vacant storefront today, just to see what's out there." Catherine sighed, a trace of worry lines deepening around her mouth. "Sweetheart, I understand you have dreams, but can we really afford to step into something so risky right now? My medical bills alone." Susan reached for her mother's hand. "I know. That's why I'm only exploring. I'm not about to sign any lease I can't pay for, but I don't want to bury this dream without even trying." She paused. "Betty said she nearly lost the Sunrise Café when she started. She got through it with help. Maybe I could find a similar way." Catherine's mouth tightened, yet her eyes flickered with a hesitant sympathy. "I don't want to hold you back. I just worry. You've always been so responsible. I'd hate to see you lose everything." The conversation ended on an uneasy note. Catherine wanted to be supportive, but fear clouded her perspective. Susan empathized with her mother's caution. Stepping into new territory was terrifying. Still, the thought of never attempting it gnawed at Susan's heart. A few days later, she received an unexpected text from Hannah. "Meet me for coffee at Midtown Bakery. I have a friend you need to meet." "Curious," Susan agreed, and they arranged a time when both could get away from the Sunrise Café. The Midtown Bakery, nestled between a bookstore and a florist, was charming in its own right. Its cheerful decor and sweet scent of pastries made Susan picture what her own cafe could be like someday. Hannah sat at a corner table with a man in a neat collared shirt, a friendly but reserved smile on his face. "Susan, this is Michael Reeves," Hannah introduced. "He's an attorney I met at a community business workshop a while back. He heard a bit about your dream and might have some ideas." Surprised, Susan offered her hand. "Nice to meet you." "I didn't realize Hannah had mentioned my plans." Hannah shrugged, offering a playful grin. "Couldn't help bragging about my friend's talents. Michael here has connections and might advise you on the legal side of starting a small business." As the three of them chatted, Michael explained basic steps like setting up an LLC, seeking small business loans, and preparing a solid business plan. Even though Susan felt out of her depth, Michael's calm explanations kindled another spark of hope. It dawned on her that she was inching further into the unknown, this special world, as she thought of it, of legal documents and property searches. The leap felt massive, but not entirely impossible. By the time they parted ways, Susan had a stack of pamphlets and the contact information of a few local resources. Outside, she paused under a street lamp, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange as the sun went down. Clutching those pamphlets, she realized she was no longer merely wishing for a dream. She was actively stepping toward it. Each small action nudged her further from her routine and closer to a reality she had once believed was out of reach. In the days that followed, Susan found herself juggling two different worlds, her regular shifts at the Sunrise Café and her after-hours foray into researching small business ownership. It was a dizzying dance, one she had never expected to perform. She kept a folder in her backpack stuffed with notes, pamphlets, and a few sketches of potential cafe layouts. She also maintained an optimistic attitude, though it was tinged with the ever-present worry of how her mother would fare with more tests on the horizon. One afternoon, Betty invited Susan to her place again, this time for a brief brainstorming session. Hannah came along too, bringing a battered notebook full of recipes she'd collected over the years. They gathered around Betty's kitchen table, sipping lemonade and discussing what a new cafe under Susan's ownership might look like. "Atmosphere is everything," Betty said, pointing to a note about interior decor. "Think about how you want people to feel when they walk through the door. Comforted, uplifted, inspired?" Susan nodded thoughtfully. "I've always wanted it to feel like an extension of someone's living room. Soft seating, a fireplace if possible, and maybe a corner with local artists' work." Hannah tapped her notebook, where she'd scribbled ideas. "And the food has to stand out. A few unique dishes could set you apart from other coffee shops. Maybe we could do a twist on classic pastries, or highlight local farm ingredients." Betty smiled approvingly, her gaze landing on Susan. "What's your signature item? If you had to pick one thing to represent your cooking, what would it be?" Susan considered the question carefully, recalling the countless hours she'd spent experimenting in the tiny kitchen at home, often with meager resources. "I've always loved making different kinds of scones. My dad used to say they were the best in town. I like to get creative with flavors, lavender, lemon, or dried cherries." "Perfect," Betty responded, jotting down a note. "A place that sells memorable scones will have people talking." They continued brainstorming for over an hour, the conversation flowing with an ease that surprised Susan. She found that once she allowed herself to explore possibilities, the ideas poured out. By the time she gathered her belongings to leave, she felt a flicker of confidence she hadn't experienced in years. But reality called as soon as she stepped outside Betty's house. Checking her phone, she saw 3 missed calls from her mother. A cold knot of worry formed in her stomach. She called back immediately, bracing for bad news. Catherine answered on the second ring, her voice subdued. "Susan, I'm at the hospital. The doctors wanted to run some additional tests tonight, something about adjusting my medication. Don't panic, but I'd appreciate it if you could swing by when you can." Heart pounding, Susan hurried to her car and drove to Winchester Medical Center. Despite Catherine's attempt at calmness, Susan couldn't shake the surge of dread that made her grip the steering wheel tighter. She navigated the hospital corridors with practiced familiarity, greeting nurses she'd come to know on a first-name basis. Catherine was in a small, curtained-off alcove in the emergency wing, an IV drip attached to her arm. She smiled weakly when she saw her daughter. "They say it's just a precaution," she explained. "You know how they are. Better safe than sorry." Susan gently clasped her mother's hand, eyes scanning Catherine's weary face. "Why didn't you call me earlier? I could have driven you here." "I didn't want to disrupt your evening," Catherine answered quietly. "I know you've been busy thinking about the future." Susan's throat tightened. Any flicker of excitement she'd felt about her potential cafe flickered unsteadily. "Mom, I'm never too busy for you. Please don't think that." Catherine gave a small nod, squeezing Susan's hand. "I'm proud of you, you know that. I may not always show it, but I see how hard you work and how much heart you put into everything." They spoke in hushed tones until a nurse appeared to escort Catherine for more tests, leaving Susan alone in the curtained space. She sank into a plastic chair, hugging herself as the hospital's fluorescent lighting hummed overhead. Waves of doubt flooded her mind. How could she commit to a major investment or even a loan when Catherine's condition could demand all her finances at any moment? A few minutes later, her phone vibrated. Thinking it might be the nurse or a family friend, she looked at the screen, only to see a text from an unknown number that read, "Susan, it's Aaron. I owe you a proper thank you. Please, let me know when we can talk." She stared, momentarily stunned. Her heart skipped a beat. In the midst of her fear and uncertainty, Aaron had reappeared. She didn't know how he got her number, but the coincidence felt strangely timed, as if fate was reminding her that sometimes hope arrives precisely when doubt threatens to overwhelm. Still, she made no immediate reply. First, she needed to ensure her mother was safe. Everything else would have to wait, even if only until the night's worries were settled. Catherine was discharged the next morning with an adjusted prescription and orders to rest for a few days. Susan, physically and emotionally drained, made a quick breakfast of oatmeal before coaxing her mother to lie down. Once Catherine was settled, Susan sat on the couch and glanced at her phone again. The message from Aaron still glowed on the screen. "Susan, it's Aaron. I owe you a proper thank you. Please let me know when we can talk." For a moment, she debated ignoring it, too uncertain about everything else in her life, but curiosity, and perhaps a trace of nostalgia, proved stronger. Typing a brief reply, she wrote, "Hi, Aaron, this is Susan. How did you get my number?" The phone rang less than a minute later. She answered quietly, stepping onto the front porch so as not to disturb her mother. "Hello." "Hi, Susan." "I'm sorry if this is abrupt," Aaron said, his voice noticeably steadier than when she'd seen him at the cafe. "I asked Hannah for your number. I hope that's okay." Susan's pulse quickened at the mention of Hannah. Her friend must have encountered Aaron somehow. "That's fine. Is everything all right?" He let out a quiet laugh, a touch self-conscious. "I'm better now than I was. You helped me at a really low moment. I remember you said your name was Susan, but I didn't realize we might have known each other when we were kids. Hannah suggested that might be the case." Susan pressed her free hand against the porch railing. "I had a feeling it could be you. Aaron Parker, right? We used to live a few houses apart when we were small. Well, you look different." He exhaled, and she could almost imagine him nodding. "I've been through a lot since leaving Winchester. It's a long story, and I'd like to explain it. Can we meet, maybe somewhere quiet?" Despite the uncertainty tangled in her thoughts, she found herself agreeing. "Sure. There's a little diner near the hospital, Hilltop Diner. I can meet you there tomorrow morning before my shift. Does that work?" "It does," he replied, relief evident in his tone. "Thank you. And thank you for everything else, too." After ending the call, Susan leaned against the porch post, staring at the autumn leaves scattered across the yard. Life felt like it was hurtling forward in ways she never anticipated. Her mother's health shifting, her own dream taking shape in baby steps, and now the re-emergence of an old friend she'd once thought gone forever. The next morning, she arrived at Hilltop Diner just after sunrise. The smell of bacon and coffee saturated the air, and the vinyl booths were half filled with locals grabbing breakfast. Aaron stood by a corner table, wearing a clean button-down shirt and jeans. He looked healthier, though there was still a certain seriousness around his eyes. "Susan," he greeted, gesturing for her to sit. "Thanks for coming." She slid into the booth, a mixture of nerves and anticipation swirling in her chest. "Of course." The waitress approached, took their orders, scrambled eggs for her, black coffee for him, then left them alone. Aaron studied Susan, a faint smile touching his lips. "I can't believe I'm actually sitting here with you. I used to wonder what happened to that girl who shared her crayons and treats with me." Her cheeks warmed. "I was so young back then, but I never forgot you either." "When your family left town, my parents just told me you moved away." She paused, memories of simpler times buzzing in her mind. "I didn't think we'd ever cross paths again." Aaron nodded, tapping a finger on the table. "That move was sudden. My dad lost his job, we lost the house, and we ended up in a rough spot. Over the years, things got more complicated. I ended up, well, on the streets for a while." He cleared his throat. "You probably guessed that part when you saw me at the cafe." Susan's heart constricted. "I'm so sorry. I wish I'd known. Maybe I could have—" She stopped, realizing how futile those words were. "But I'm glad you're here now." They spoke in hushed voices for nearly an hour. He recounted an abbreviated version of his story, leaving Winchester in financial ruin, struggling to find stable work, eventually falling in with the wrong crowd and drifting from one city to another. He admitted he returned to Winchester out of desperation, barely able to afford the bus ticket. "So when you helped me," Aaron said, his eyes glistening with genuine gratitude, "it was more than a meal. It was hope. I remembered you, how you used to be so kind, even when we were kids." He let out a shaky breath. "I think that's what kept me from giving up completely." Susan felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I'm glad I could do something, and I'm so sorry for everything you've gone through." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm getting back on my feet. I found a small motel I can afford for now, picking up odd jobs. And about that cafe meal you gave me, I'd like to pay you back." Susan shook her head gently. "You don't owe me anything. The past doesn't matter. I'm just glad you're doing better." For a moment, neither spoke. They simply let the warmth of shared childhood memories and new beginnings fill the silence. When the waitress returned with their check, Aaron insisted on paying, a symbolic gesture that made Susan smile. Despite all her anxieties and doubts, she realized she was forging a new alliance of sorts with an old friend whose path had inexplicably wound its way back to hers. Later that week, Susan tried to split her energy between her shifts at the Sunrise Café and the quiet but steady progress toward her own business plan. She updated her notebook with every relevant detail she could find: rental prices, cost of ingredients, potential staffing needs. Occasionally, she'd steal a moment to chat with Betty about how to handle unexpected expenses or marketing. Even so, life refused to move in a straight line. One afternoon, Norman Miller summoned her to the office in the back. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and old ledger paper, the overhead light buzzing softly. He gestured for her to sit, his usual frown carving lines across his brow. "I've noticed you've been distracted, Susan," he began, tapping a pen against the desk. "I know Betty thinks highly of you, but if your mind isn't fully here, we're going to have a problem." A surge of anxiety rippled through her. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with Catherine's health still in question. "I'm sorry if I've seemed preoccupied. My mother's condition worsened recently, and it's been a lot to handle." Norman's eyes flickered with what might have been sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by his managerial caution. "I understand personal matters can interfere, but we run on a tight margin. You can't be giving out free meals to random strangers or missing steps in customer service." She swallowed, recalling that day she'd fed Aaron. "I've paid for that meal out of my wages, Mr. Miller, and I've done my best to keep my performance consistent." He sighed, leaning back in the squeaking chair. "Look, you're a good worker, but we can't risk losses." He paused, eyes narrowing. "You're not planning on leaving us, are you? Some folks have mentioned you've been looking at commercial properties." Susan's heart raced. She thought she'd been discreet about her property searches. Perhaps word had gotten around town. "I'm just exploring options," she finally said, her voice careful. "It doesn't mean I'm leaving tomorrow." Norman studied her closely. "Well, do what you must, but don't neglect your duties here. Betty and I both rely on your steady hand at the counter. If you get too ambitious, you might find yourself overwhelmed." The underlying threat wasn't lost on Susan. She left the office with tight shoulders, anger and worry mingling inside her. As she returned to the main floor, Betty caught her eye from behind the pastry case, a questioning look on her face. Susan merely offered a tight smile, not wanting to stir more trouble. That evening, Catherine's test results came in, suggesting she'd need a minor surgery in the next few months. The cost was daunting. Susan felt torn. Any savings could be better spent securing her mother's health rather than on a rental deposit for a new cafe space. Still, the dream clung to her heart like a lifeline, something that kept her spirit afloat. But a moral question weighed heavily. Should she keep pushing for the cafe or direct all her energy and every spare dollar to her mother's care? A day later, she shared the news with Aaron during a walk near Winchester's small lakeside park. He listened intently, hands in his jacket pockets. The crisp air carried the scent of damp leaves, and a cool breeze ruffled Susan's hair. He took a moment to respond, his breath escaping in visible puffs. "I know I'm hardly in a place to give advice, but maybe there's a balance. If opening your cafe is something you truly want, giving it up might create resentment later, but your mom's health is urgent." Susan stared at the lake's still surface, her voice trembling. "It feels selfish to choose my dream over her needs. She's all I've got, and I'm all she's got. Every time I think about stepping away, I remember I'm leaving her behind." Aaron nudged a pebble into the water, watching the ripples. "Maybe the question isn't about leaving her behind, but figuring out a situation that helps both of you. If the cafe eventually succeeds, you'd have more financial stability to support your mom, but I get that it's a gamble." She sighed, the conflict in her heart heavy. "It's a big risk, especially with money so tight. Norman is already giving me grief at work, and I can't afford to lose that paycheck. Mom doesn't outright say it, but I know she's scared I'll burn all our savings." A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions. Aaron broke it softly. "You know, if there was any way I could help, I would. You gave me hope when I had none, Susan." She glanced at him, touched by the genuine concern in his eyes. "Thank you. But you're still trying to get back on your feet." He nodded, lips pressed together in a thin line. "I am, but one day I won't be as stuck as I am now. When that day comes, I'd like to repay your kindness." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. She realized that beneath the moral struggle of whether to pursue her dream or put it on hold, another complication was growing, her affection for Aaron. She cared about him, both as the boy she'd known and the man he was trying to become. Yet the timing felt impossible. Every choice she faced carried weighty consequences, and she feared letting anyone else down. As they strolled back toward the parking lot, dark clouds gathered overhead, matching the tension in Susan's chest. The pressure from Norman, her mother's health, and her own desire to move forward all loomed like an approaching storm. She knew a confrontation of some sort was inevitable, and the uncertainty of how to handle it gnawed at her peace. She would have to navigate that moral obstacle soon, deciding not just what path to choose, but how to live with the consequences of her decision. Susan woke to an early spring drizzle tapping against her bedroom window, a soft reminder that her life felt as unsettled as the weather outside. Over the previous weeks, she had found herself balancing multiple tensions: her ailing mother's impending surgery, the uneasy truce with Norman at the Sunrise Café, and a growing sense that she needed to take concrete steps toward her own business dream. Though the situation felt overwhelming, she kept returning to the same conclusion. If she wanted to move forward, she had to face these challenges one by one. That morning, she helped Catherine prepare a small breakfast, oatmeal and herbal tea, before leaving for the cafe. Her mother moved slowly, her steps shaky but determined, refusing Susan's help until she absolutely needed it. With each day, the weight of Catherine's condition settled heavier on Susan's heart, but she tried to mask it behind a reassuring smile. At the Sunrise Café, the morning rush came in waves. Tourists snapped photos of the historic street outside, while local regulars, like Mrs. Robinson, asked for their usual coffee and pastry. Susan moved efficiently between tables, jotting down orders in her small notepad. Yet, her thoughts were never fully in the moment. She couldn't stop considering how to handle the medical bills. Even with insurance, Catherine's upcoming procedure threatened to consume any savings Susan might have scraped together. After the breakfast crowd thinned, Betty waved Susan over to a quiet corner. "I've been watching you, dear. You look exhausted," Betty said, concern etched into her features. "How's Catherine this morning?" Susan exhaled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "About the same. Waiting for the surgery date has her on edge. She's not sleeping well, and neither am I." Betty reached out and covered Susan's hand. "You need to take care of yourself too. It won't help if you wear yourself down." Susan forced a gentle smile. "I know, thank you. It's just, there's so much to juggle." She hesitated, glancing around the cafe. "And I still can't shake this dream of opening my own place." Betty gave a compassionate nod. "Dreams don't fade just because life gets harder. If anything, they become the reason to push on. Look, why don't we set aside time to review your finances? Maybe we can figure out a short-term plan." Before Susan could respond, Norman's voice broke through. "Susan, can you handle the midday orders? We're short-staffed until Hannah arrives." His tone was more directive than usual, leaving no room for debate. She excused herself from Betty, noting how his watchful eyes followed her every move. The sudden tension in the air reminded her that Norman wasn't pleased about the possibility of her leaving. For now, she put her focus back on waiting tables and clearing dishes. The hours rolled by until, finally, she reached the end of her shift, mentally counting how many extra hours she could request in the coming weeks. That evening, after she had tucked Catherine into bed, Susan opened her notebook on the small kitchen table. Bills, receipts, and a modest spreadsheet of her cafe concept stared back at her. She jotted down the approximate costs for Catherine's upcoming medical treatments, which the hospital's billing department had estimated. It was daunting, and the figure far surpassed what Susan had managed to save. The idea of launching a business at the same time seemed almost impossible. As she wrestled with these numbers, her phone vibrated. A text from Aaron lit the screen. "How are you holding up? Thinking of you and hoping all is well with your mom." In the brief span since they reconnected, he had become a steady source of emotional support. Though he wasn't in a position to solve her financial woes, Susan found solace in the way he listened and the genuine care he showed. She sent a quick reply, letting him know her mother was stable but in need of rest. A knock at the door startled Susan. It was Hannah, cradling a small stack of books. "Mind if I come in?" she asked, voice subdued. "Not at all," Susan responded, ushering her into the cramped living room. "Everything okay?" Hannah glanced down the hall toward Catherine's closed bedroom door, then turned back to Susan. "I brought something you might be interested in." She set the books on the kitchen table. They were guides on small business ownership, marketing tips, and local resources for entrepreneurs. "Michael Reeves lent me these. He said you can keep them as long as you need. He also mentioned there's a free seminar next week on small business loans at the community center." A spark of cautious hope flickered in Susan's chest. "That's really thoughtful," she said, picking up the top book. It was thick with case studies and checklists. "But I don't know how I'd afford a loan right now, not with all these medical expenses." Hannah rested a hand on her shoulder. "It never hurts to learn. And who knows, maybe there's a solution we haven't considered yet." She paused. "You're allowed small victories along the way, Susan." They spent the next hour flipping through the books, highlighting sections that addressed low-interest loans and grants for women entrepreneurs. Some programs offered sliding-scale interest rates, and one was specifically geared toward helping startups in rural communities like Winchester. By the time Hannah left, Susan felt both overloaded with information and strangely encouraged. She had begun to see small cracks where light could filter in, hints of a path forward amid the darkness of her mother's uncertain health. Later that night, while preparing for bed, Susan reflected on the day. She recognized a new resilience forming inside her. The challenges hadn't vanished. If anything, they had only multiplied. But she sensed that each test she faced, be it balancing finances, supporting her mother, or dealing with Norman's skepticism, was teaching her something about strength. She would need it in the days to come, especially if she was serious about turning her vision into reality. The following morning found Susan standing at the community center's bulletin board, scanning a flyer that promoted a session on small business financing. She had managed to slip away from the Sunrise Café during her break, thanks to Betty's willingness to cover for her. The workshop was set for that evening, and Susan decided she would attend, even though it meant coming home late. She wasn't alone in the hallway. Aaron appeared, holding 2 paper cups of coffee he'd picked up from a nearby convenience store. He offered one to her, smiling tentatively. "I wasn't sure if you still drink it black, but I remembered you never liked it too sweet." Susan raised an eyebrow. Impressed, he recalled such a minor detail from their childhood. "You remembered correctly. Thank you." He stood beside her, both sipping coffee in comfortable silence as they read through the details on the workshop flyer. "I found a part-time gig doing inventory at a warehouse," he said quietly, as if reluctant to pull the attention from her own plans. "It's not glamorous, but it's a start." A wave of warmth spread through her. "That's great, Aaron. I'm glad things are moving in a better direction for you." He nodded, then inclined his head toward the flyer. "Are you thinking of going to that seminar?" She exhaled slowly. "Yes, I want to. But every time I start to think about fully investing in this dream, I picture my mother's hospital bills piling up, and I feel guilty." Her voice trembled slightly. "Am I a horrible daughter for still chasing this idea when she needs so much care?" Aaron's gaze was steady, empathetic. "I don't believe it's selfish. You're trying to build a more secure life for both of you. It's normal to feel torn, though." She let his words sink in. The old guilt twisted inside her. She couldn't deny there was a moral conflict brewing, whether to channel all her resources into Catherine's immediate needs or to take a risk that might, in the long term, grant them both stability. Lost in thought, she didn't realize Aaron was studying her closely, as if he had something more to say. Eventually, they made their way into an empty meeting room to wait for the session to begin. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, a makeshift stage at the front with a lectern and a projector screen. A few other attendees arrived, settling in with pens and notepads. Susan recognized at least one face from around town, Mrs. Warren, who ran a small craft store that was struggling. The workshop kicked off with a local banker explaining loan options, interest rates, and credit requirements. Susan scribbled notes, her mind racing at terms like collateral and minimum credit scores. She felt a twinge of shame thinking about her own credit situation, battered by years of medical debts and tight budgets. Still, knowledge was power, and she clung to the hope that some resource here might help her find a viable path. During a break, Aaron offered to refill her coffee and strolled toward a makeshift refreshments table. Susan noticed Michael Reeves in the audience and waved him over. He took a seat beside her, flipping through a brochure he'd picked up at the door. "You're doing the right thing by being here," Michael remarked, his voice low to avoid interrupting the ongoing discussion. "Even if you don't move forward with a loan right away, this will help you plan." Susan fidgeted with her pen. "I know, it's just there's still so much uncertainty with my mother's health." Michael's expression was kind. "No one's rushing you. Focus on what's best in the long run. If that means waiting, then wait. But if it means taking a calculated risk, I believe you can handle it." She tried to picture herself at the helm of her own cafe, greeting patrons and perfecting recipes, while also safeguarding enough money for Catherine's care. The tension remained thick, though especially when her phone buzzed with a text from Hannah. "Hey, your mom seems restless. Wants to know if you're coming home soon." Guilt flared up again. She pictured Catherine alone, possibly anxious about the future. Susan felt caught between roles, devoted daughter on one hand, aspiring entrepreneur on the other. She was beginning to question whether these two identities could coexist peacefully. When the workshop ended, Susan stood in the parking lot, hugging the stack of brochures and notes to her chest. The evening air was cool, and the fluorescent glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Aaron caught up to her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "How do you feel?" "Overwhelmed, informed, afraid," she admitted, managing a tight smile. "All of the above." He nodded. "I'd call that progress." "You're facing your fears instead of ignoring them." She appreciated the sentiment, but her mind churned with unanswered questions. Balancing ethics and practicality felt heavier than ever. If she miscalculated, she might end up failing her mother and losing this once-in-a-lifetime chance at pursuing her dream. She couldn't decide which outcome terrified her more. A week later, as Susan gathered her courage to leave for a follow-up doctor's appointment with Catherine, an official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. The return address read Winchester Medical Center. With shaky hands, Susan tore it open. It was an updated invoice and a letter of explanation, informing her that part of the proposed surgery wouldn't be fully covered by Catherine's insurance. A four-figure sum glared up at her from the page, demanding a payment schedule that felt impossible. Catherine, seated at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of tea, noticed Susan's pallor. "Bad news," she ventured, voice soft. Susan forced herself to read the details before answering, unwilling to hide the reality. "They're saying we have to put down a deposit on the surgery. If we don't, they might postpone it." Catherine's face fell. She set her mug down with an unsteady hand. "I'm sorry, dear. I can reach out to an old family friend, see if they can lend us." Susan stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her mother's shoulder. "Don't. I'll figure something out." As they drove to the doctor's office, the tension inside the car felt thick. The hum of the engine mixed with the sound of rain pelting the windshield. Susan kept her gaze on the road, her mind racing through possible solutions. She could try for a personal loan, but her credit wasn't strong. She could ask Michael Reeves for advice, but she doubted a bank would be enthusiastic about financing medical debt on top of a new business. At the medical center, Dr. Manning confirmed that Catherine should schedule the surgery soon, ideally within the month, to prevent further complications. Susan asked about payment plans, but the staff explained that certain specialists required partial prepayment. The hopelessness in Catherine's eyes pained Susan more than any sum on a piece of paper. They returned home to find the house cold and dim, the heat turned low in an effort to keep utility bills manageable. Susan guided Catherine onto the couch, fetched a warm blanket, then headed to the kitchen to make soup. She realized she was operating on autopilot. Her mind felt numb. Though she had daydreamed about a cafe just last week, the presence of this monstrous medical bill made the dream appear frivolous. That evening, Aaron called, his voice carrying a brightness that Susan couldn't quite match. "I got some good news. The warehouse is taking me on full-time. It comes with health benefits and a better hourly wage. I wanted to share it with you because, well, you're one of the few people I trust in this town." Susan mustered a subdued smile, even though he couldn't see her through the phone. "Aaron, that's wonderful. I'm happy for you." He hesitated, picking up on the lack of enthusiasm in her voice. "Hey, what's wrong?" She debated telling him, uncertain if this was a burden he needed to share. After a moment, she decided it was okay to be honest. Mum's surgery won't be covered the way we hoped. The hospital wants a large sum up front. I'm not sure how to handle it." Aaron was quiet for a few seconds, the silence heavy in her ear. Finally, he spoke gently, as though afraid to overstep. "Susan, I know money is tight. I don't have a lot to spare yet, but maybe we could figure something out. There must be assistance programs or maybe a fundraising platform online." She sighed, fatigue coating her words. "It's not that simple, Aaron. My mother's proud, and even if I could raise money that way, it might not be enough. I can't take out another loan, and that probably means my own cafe dream is on hold, maybe indefinitely." "Don't say that," he replied, his tone edging toward urgency. "I understand how desperate this situation is, but I've seen your passion for what you want to create. It's part of who you are." Warm tears gathered in Susan's eyes. She blinked them away, not wanting to cry over the phone. Sometimes you have to let go of a dream, right? Maybe it's just not the right time. Aaron paused. She could hear him exhale. "I don't believe that for a second. Listen, if you ever need help, real help, promise me you'll tell me. I owe you more than you realize." She thanked him politely, unsure what he meant by owing her more than she realized. After they hung up, Susan sat there in the glow of the kitchen light, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. It felt like she was staring at a towering, insurmountable wall. Her mother needed urgent care, and there was no clear way to manage it while also keeping her personal aspirations alive. The thought that she might abandon her lifelong dream weighed on her, but the alternative, jeopardizing Catherine's well-being, was unthinkable. She went to bed that night feeling trapped, her hope overshadowed by the largest obstacle she had ever faced. Just when it seemed that all roads were blocked, a slight shift occurred. Betty, ever perceptive, noticed Susan's anguish and arranged a discreet meeting at her home. Hannah and Michael Reeves also gathered in the cozy living room, where a teapot of chamomile steeped on the coffee table. Outside, dusk settled over the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold. Once they were all seated, Betty cleared her throat. "Susan, I know things feel impossible right now, but we've been talking. We might have a suggestion." Hannah offered a supportive nod. "We know about the surgery costs, and we're aware you're considering giving up on the cafe idea, but maybe there's a way to keep both afloat." Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I spoke with an acquaintance who runs a local non-profit that assists families facing medical crises. They can sometimes negotiate costs with hospitals, helping to reduce bills or set up manageable payment plans. It's not a guarantee, but it's worth exploring." Susan's eyes widened with cautious hope. "I've never heard of such a program. Are you sure it applies to situations like mine?" "Yes, and the best part is, they're used to dealing with partial payments," Michael explained. "They could help advocate for your mother, so you wouldn't be alone in negotiations with the hospital. At the very least, it might buy you time." Betty gave a warm smile. "Even a small reduction in costs could make a difference. It could ease some of the pressure. You might not have to abandon your dream just yet." A wave of gratitude washed over Susan. This means so much. I'll do anything if it helps my mom." She paused, glancing at Hannah. "I just feel like I'm taking everyone's kindness and giving nothing back." Hannah reached over and squeezed her hand. "Don't be silly. You've always been there for me. Remember how you babysat my twins so I could pick up extra shifts? Friends help each other." Michael handed Susan a small business card. "This is the contact for the non-profit. Her name is Marjorie Scott. Give her a call tomorrow. She's expecting to hear from you." Though the plan was only a potential stepping stone, Susan felt as though she'd been offered a lifeline. That night, after returning home, she sat beside Catherine on the couch, carefully explaining the idea of seeking the non-profit's assistance. Catherine listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity. By the end, she nodded in subdued agreement. Early the next morning, Susan made the call, heart pounding. Marjorie, a compassionate-sounding woman, asked for details about Catherine's situation. She spoke with calm authority, assuring Susan that many hospitals were open to negotiation if they knew a reputable organization was involved. Marjorie promised to reach out to Winchester Medical Center on Susan's behalf. Within days, Marjorie returned with the first piece of good news Susan had received in weeks. The hospital was open to creating a long-term payment plan that wouldn't require the entire sum up front. Though it wasn't a perfect solution, the deposit amount was significantly reduced, allowing Catherine to move forward with scheduling her surgery. Overcome with relief, Susan rushed to the Sunrise Café to tell Betty the update. They embraced by the pastry display, ignoring a quizzical glance from Norman. Hannah soon joined them, squealing with excitement at the news. For a brief moment, Susan felt buoyant, as though a massive weight had been lifted from her chest. That night, she texted Aaron about the development, her words tinged with optimism. He called almost immediately. "That's amazing, Susan. I knew something would come through for you." She breathed into the phone, a smile on her lips. "It's a partial victory, but it's enough to keep me from giving up entirely. Catherine's surgery can be scheduled soon. I'm still going to need multiple jobs and a careful budget, but at least we're moving forward." Aaron's voice softened. "You deserve some good news. It's about time the universe gave you a break." She laughed quietly, a rare sound in recent days. "I'm just grateful for the people who stepped in to help. It's humbling, you know." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, memories of childhood games and silly mishaps, until Susan felt the tension in her own shoulders ease. Even though the challenge wasn't fully resolved, she savored the partial triumph. For the first time in too long, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of still pursuing her cafe venture. Before falling asleep that night, Susan updated her notes and adjusted her financial projections. Though her mother's well-being remained her top priority, this sign of progress stirred the embers of her dream. Life had taught her not to celebrate prematurely, but sometimes a small step forward provided just enough hope to keep going. With the payment plan arranged, Catherine's surgery date was set for 3 weeks ahead. The days seemed to move at a rapid pace, each one filled with a combination of cautious optimism and lingering apprehension. Susan spent her mornings and afternoons at the Sunrise Café, her evenings finalizing Catherine's arrangements for the hospital stay, and any spare moments studying the business materials Betty and Michael had given her. The tension with Norman, however, hadn't improved. One afternoon, he motioned for Susan to join him in the back office. The worn, fluorescent light flickered overhead as he closed the door behind them. "Susan," he began, folding his arms, "I heard about your mother's situation, and I'm genuinely sorry she's going through that, but I also hear you're still set on starting your own place." She felt her stomach tighten. "It's a possibility down the road, yes. But right now, my focus is on my mom." He nodded, though his expression stayed guarded. "I need a stable team here. If you're halfway out the door, it affects morale and profits. I'm prepared to offer you a modest raise if you can commit to staying at least a year." He paused, weighing her reaction. "That might help with your mother's bills." Susan's heart pounded. A raise would be a much-needed relief, but it came with strings. She would be promising to put her cafe dream on hold, at least formally, for a year. She pressed her lips together, considering the implications. "That's generous. I have to think about it." Norman's frown lines deepened. "Don't take too long," he said, then sighed. "I value what you bring to this place, Susan. I just need to know I can rely on you." In a daze, she left the office. Betty intercepted her in the hallway, worry shadowing her features. I couldn't help noticing Norman's mood. Everything okay? Susan explained the raise and the condition attached. Betty pursed her lips. It's understandable he wants consistency, but you have to decide if that year's delay is worth it. I don't want to see you stuck here forever if your heart lies elsewhere. The rest of the day was a blur, with Susan immersed in her usual tasks, but her mind churned with indecision. A stable income would help with Catherine's post-surgery care, but it also meant shelving her cafe plans yet again. She confided in Hannah, who listened with a thoughtful expression. I get the temptation, Hannah admitted. A little more money in your pocket sounds good, especially now, but you have to ask yourself, is it just a delay or is it giving up on your dream entirely? You know how 1 year can roll into the next? That evening, Susan stopped by Aaron's motel room for the first time, a small container of homemade soup in hand. He greeted her at the door with a kind smile, stepping aside so she could enter the modest space. The place was clean but sparse, just a bed, a dresser, and a small table. She noticed a well-worn notebook on the table with some scribbled notes, likely related to his new warehouse job. Thank you for the soup, he said, closing the door. You really didn't have to. She shrugged, setting it down. You've been working long shifts, and I figured you might not have time to cook. Besides, it's the least I can do after all your support. They settled around the small table, taking cautious sips from chipped mugs of tea he had prepared. She told him about Norman's offer, wrestling aloud with the pros and cons. Aaron listened carefully before replying. A year can feel like forever when you have a dream on the line, but if the raise truly helps your mom, I can see how it might be worth it. He fiddled with the handle of his mug. If only there was another way to get that extra money. Susan studied him, noticing a flicker of something unresolved in his eyes. Aaron, you keep hinting that you owe me more than I realize. What do you mean by that? He pressed his lips together, looking momentarily conflicted. I told you I've been scraping by, rebuilding, but there's a side to that story I haven't fully explained. He exhaled slowly. Look, I got involved with a risky investment group a while back, and there's a chance, just a chance, that things might pay off. If it does, it could be significant. Her brows knit in concern. Risky investment group. Are you safe? He lifted a hand to calm her worry. I'm not in danger. It's all above board now, just complicated. I'm waiting for final confirmations. If it comes through, I could finally stand on my own 2 feet and help you. But until I know for sure, I'd rather not raise your hopes. Susan felt her pulse pick up. Could it be that Aaron was on the verge of a major windfall? Part of her longed to believe it, but another part remained skeptical. She nodded, laying a hand gently over his. I understand, but don't put yourself at risk for me. He shook his head. It's not just for you. I need a fresh start. If all goes well, maybe we both get one. They spent the next hour exchanging hopes and fears, though neither had the final answers. Still, Susan left feeling that a pivotal moment was approaching, one in which all the preparations, sacrifices, and tests they'd endured would lead to a defining challenge. With her mother's surgery looming and Norman's ultimatum on the table, she sensed she was on the brink of a crucial decision that would shape not just her career path, but her future with Aaron and the life she envisioned for herself and her mother. Catherine's surgery loomed just days away. Despite the payment plan Susan had arranged with help from the non-profit, the hospital still required a sizable deposit before proceeding. It was a sum Susan could manage only if she pulled from every source she had, her modest savings, a small personal loan she managed to secure through a local credit union, and, to her reluctant gratitude, the small raise Norman had offered at the Sunrise Café. Yet acceptance of Norman's terms weighed heavily on her. She had neither formally agreed nor declined, suspended in a state of indecision that left her anxious and restless. On a damp, overcast morning, Susan called out a quick goodbye to Catherine and headed to the Sunrise Café, determined to give Norman her final answer. She had spent the night poring over every calculation she could think of: monthly bills, medical costs, the estimated timeline for opening a cafe of her own. No matter how she ran the numbers, the raise made an undeniable difference, at least in the short term. Her heart clenched at the thought of postponing her dream for another year, but perhaps it was the most responsible path. The day started out busy, with a steady stream of customers. Norman seemed on edge, checking the register totals more often than usual. Betty cast Susan the occasional glance, as though trying to gauge her mood, but she didn't interfere. By lunchtime, Susan's feet ached and her head pounded from the swirl of voices and the hiss of the espresso machine. Finally, she slipped into the back office and found Norman going over the previous day's receipts. He looked up, pen stilling in his hand. "Susan, I've been waiting for you to come by." She closed the door behind her. "I've decided. I'll take the raise on the condition that I can still leave after a year. If my mother's health stabilizes by then, I want to have the freedom to move on." Norman nodded, relief flickering across his face. "That seems fair. I'll have the paperwork drawn up. You do good work here, and I'd like to keep you as long as possible." Tension coiled inside Susan. She hated feeling as though she'd just signed away part of her future. But Catherine's well-being came first. She forced a polite smile, then left the office to return to her tables. Betty caught up to her near the beverage station. Her brow creased in concern. "Did you?" Susan nodded. "I agreed. I need the extra money so I can cover the hospital's deposit. I promised myself it's only for a year." Betty touched Susan's arm gently. "I understand. A year isn't forever, child. But don't lose sight of what you really want." Susan couldn't speak for a moment, afraid she'd burst into tears. Instead, she squeezed Betty's hand and carried on. The rest of her shift was mechanical, each refill of a mug or clearing of a plate done on autopilot. By evening, she left the cafe with a heavy heart, telling herself that sacrificing her short-term desire might be the best chance for Catherine's long-term recovery. When she arrived home, Aaron was waiting outside in his old sedan, engine idling. She approached his rolled-down window, surprised to see him this late in the day. "Hey," she greeted, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. "What brings you here?" He turned off the engine and stepped out, his expression tinged with an excitement he didn't try to hide. "I know it's sudden, but something big happened today. Can I come in for a minute?" They slipped into the modest living room, where Catherine was napping under a quilt. Aaron's voice dropped to a hushed tone as he explained, "The investment deal I told you about. It came through. Well, at least the first part of it. I've received a partial payout, and Susan, it's a lot more than I ever expected." Her breath caught. "That's incredible. Does this mean you can afford a better place? Maybe a new car?" He gave a short laugh. "Yes, eventually, but that's not why I'm here." Pausing, he ran a hand through his hair. "I want to help you, both of you. If there's any deposit or medical bill you're still short on, let me fill in the gap. It's the least I can do, given everything you've done for me." Her initial reaction was shock, followed by a rush of conflicting emotions: gratitude, relief, and a prickling sense of pride that resisted handouts. "Aaron, I can't let you just pay my mother's bills. You fought so hard to rebuild your own life. I can't let you risk your fresh start on me." He shook his head. "It's not a risk. This money is already cleared. And I'm not blindly throwing it around. Trust me, I'm being careful, but I want you to know you have options. Maybe you don't need Norman's deal. Maybe you can keep moving toward your dream cafe and you won't have to wait a year." Susan's mind reeled. The deposit she needed for the surgery was days away from its due date. She had just committed herself to staying at Sunrise for another year. Yet here was Aaron, presenting a chance to break free of that compromise. The possibility hit her like a jolt of lightning. Catherine stirred, blinking groggily at them from the couch. "Susan, everything all right, dear?" Quickly crossing the room, Susan kneeled by her mother. "Yes, Mom, everything's fine. Aaron was just sharing some good news about his finances." Catherine managed a faint smile. "I'm glad. You deserve all the luck in the world, young man." Aaron returned the smile warmly, though his gaze stayed on Susan. She could practically read the words in his eyes. This could change everything. But was she ready to accept such a gift, or a loan, or whatever form of help he was offering? That night, after Aaron left, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The idea of letting him shoulder part of the financial burden was tempting, but pride and caution warred within her. She had seen how money could complicate relationships. If she accepted, would it bind her too closely to him? Would it create future resentment, or would it free her to do what she truly desired? As the clock ticked past midnight, a sense of impending confrontation settled over her. She had no illusions that this was a neat or simple fix. Everything she had faced so far, the moral debates, the heartbreak of possibly giving up her dream, now converged into a stark choice. And making that choice would require facing her deepest fear, depending on someone else. The next morning, Susan drove Catherine to a pre-surgery appointment at Winchester Medical. The humming of the car's engine provided a steady background for the tension that crackled between them. Catherine's health had shown no improvement, yet she put on a brave face. Meanwhile, Susan's mind churned over Aaron's offer, the Sunrise Café contract, and the complexities of pride versus genuine relief. At the hospital, nurses ushered Catherine into an examination room. While Catherine underwent routine tests, Susan wandered the hallway, eventually finding a waiting area with large windows overlooking the Shenandoah Valley. The sight of rolling hills reminded her of childhood daydreams, rolling out dough in a bakery, greeting neighbors who came for her warm scones, and sharing laughter at mismatched tables. She exhaled, realizing how close she'd come to abandoning that dream altogether. When Catherine emerged from the exam room, she looked worn but hopeful. "They say everything's set for the procedure next week," she explained. "We just need to finalize the payment by Friday." Susan gave a tentative smile, though her nerves frayed at the reminder. "We'll manage, Mom, one way or another." Back home, Susan guided Catherine to the couch. The older woman settled under a blanket, then patted the cushion beside her. "Sit with me." "We need to talk." Susan sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "Is something wrong?" Catherine's gaze grew solemn. "I see the conflict in your eyes, child. You're not sleeping well, and I'm sure part of it is money worries. But I suspect there's more." Unsure how to begin, Susan hesitated, yet Catherine's gentle but insistent look convinced her to be direct. "Aaron offered to help cover the remaining deposit. He's come into some money, apparently through an investment. I haven't told him yes or no." Catherine arched a brow. "You say that like it's a bad thing. Having someone willing to help is a blessing, Susan, especially if it can keep you from sacrificing your cafe dream." Susan let out a shaky breath. "Mom, you raised me to be independent. Accepting that much money feels like it feels risky. What if it changes our relationship? What if something goes wrong, or he ends up needing the money back?" Catherine reached for her hand, speaking with quiet conviction. "I did raise you to be strong and kind, but there's a difference between pride and self-preservation. Sometimes you have to let go of pride for the sake of what's best. Besides," she added, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Aaron doesn't strike me as the kind of man who'd hold this over your head." Susan considered her mother's words, a layer of relief mingling with lingering doubt. She realized that Catherine, of all people, understood the cost of turning down help when it was truly needed. The older woman had endured years of stubborn independence, refusing to ask others for financial assistance, and it had led to an endless cycle of debt. Later that day, as Susan was flipping through loan papers at the kitchen table, the phone rang. She picked it up, bracing for another hospital or insurance call, but was greeted instead by Norman's familiar, curt tone. "Susan, about that raise. I'm finalizing the documents this afternoon. I need you to come in tomorrow morning to sign them." She swallowed. "Of course, Mr. Miller, I'll be there." Ending the call, she stared at the phone in her hand. If she signed those papers, she would commit to another year, ensuring a stable, albeit modest, income. On the other hand, Aaron's offer could free her to invest in her cafe dreams sooner, but would it also tie her to him in a way she wasn't ready for? In the midst of this internal debate, a text notification flashed across her screen. It was Aaron. "Just checking in. Hope all is well with your mom. I'll be at the motel if you want to talk." Heart thumping, Susan realized she owed him a response. After a few moments of staring at the phone, she tapped out a short message. "Mom's stable. Need some time to think about your offer. Can I stop by later?" Almost instantly, her phone buzzed again. "Yes, any time." When evening arrived and Catherine was napping, Susan took a deep breath, grabbed her keys, and drove to the modest motel where Aaron was staying. The sky glowed with the last rays of sunset, painting the horizon in oranges and purples. As she parked, she silently rehearsed how she might politely decline or partially accept his financial help. She couldn't decide which approach she would land on, only that she needed to be honest with him about her fears. She found Aaron in his room, going through paperwork of his own, lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. Yet he greeted her with a warm smile. "Thanks for coming," he said softly, stepping aside so she could enter. She crossed into the room, her resolve wavering as she met his gaze. "We need to talk," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "About everything." Susan and Aaron sat facing each other at the small table inside his motel room, a single lamp casting flickering shadows on the wall. Though the air conditioner rattled softly, the weight of their conversation created an almost suffocating tension. Susan clasped her hands together, summoning the courage to speak first. "I've made so many compromises already," she began, her voice subdued. "I've told Norman I'll stay at the Sunrise Cafe for another year, and it feels like I'm postponing my life. When you offered to help with Mom's bills, a part of me lit up with hope, but I'm also afraid." Aaron watched her closely, empathy lining his features. "Afraid of what?" Her gaze dropped to the table. "Afraid of losing my independence, afraid this could change how we see each other. Money can complicate relationships, and I don't want us to end up resenting each other." He leaned in, placing a steady hand on hers. "I understand your concerns. I'm not saying it's easy, but if this allows you to keep your dream alive and ensures your mother gets her surgery, wouldn't that be worth it?" His voice softened. "Susan, the money is there, and I've set aside enough to cover my own expenses. This isn't a loan I need back in a week or a month. If you decide to pay me back over time, that's okay. If not, I see it as me finally repaying you for all the kindness you showed me when I had nothing." She swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes. "You keep saying I gave you so much, but it was just a plate of food." He shook his head, eyes glimmering with sincerity. "It was the only gesture of mercy I'd experienced in a very long time. You didn't just feed me, You made me believe I was still worth saving." A silence descended, punctuated only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. Gently, she withdrew her hand from his and pressed her palms to her cheeks, trying to ground herself. "I need to think about how to make this work. There's also the question of my agreement with Norman. If I don't sign that contract, I'll lose the raise. But if I do sign it, I might not need as much from you. At the same time, that locks me into another year there, and Aaron raised a hand, cutting off her rambling. "Let's break this down. Your mother's surgery deposit is due soon. That's priority number one. If I cover the remainder, you don't need Norman's raise. You could stay for a few more months, covering bills as you do now, and then leave the cafe when you're ready." Her breathing quickened at the thought. It sounds too ideal. "What about my own credit and the business costs if I start a new cafe? I'd still need more capital." Aaron looked down at the swirl pattern on the table, choosing his words carefully. "I might be in a position to invest, not just toss you money, but partner with you if that's something you'd want. I can't say my finances are infinite, but they're significant enough now that I could share resources." A swirl of excitement sparked within her, but she tempered it with caution. "You want to be my partner in business?" He shrugged modestly. "I can handle the financial side, at least initially. I trust your vision for how to run the place. We could write up a proper contract, with Michael Reeves's help, so it's legally clear how everything's divided. If things go sour, we'll have a framework in place to avoid personal conflict." She studied him with admiration, realizing how far he'd come from the desperate man she had met at the cafe not so long ago. "You've thought this through." His lips curved into a small grin. I've been thinking about it since that first day you recognized me, or almost recognized me. I knew then that I wanted to be part of something meaningful, not just chase money. When I looked at you, I saw someone who never gave up on kindness or on dreams, despite all life threw at you. Her chest tightened, a wave of gratitude and awe washing over her. This was a chance at self-reinvention, not only for her, but for Aaron as well. "Let me be honest, I'm terrified," she confessed. "It's not just about money. It's about trusting someone with my life's ambition." Aaron nodded, sincerity in his gaze. "That's fair. I can't promise no bumps along the way, but I can promise I'll handle this responsibly. I've seen what it's like to have nothing, and I never want to go back there." After another contemplative pause, she inhaled a steadying breath. "I can't give you an answer tonight, but I appreciate knowing what's possible. This changes everything, Aaron." He nodded. "Take your time. But remember, time is precious, especially with your mom. Don't let fear steal the moment from you." She stood, placing a hand on his shoulder in silent thanks before moving toward the door. Her emotions felt like a chaotic storm, part exhilaration, part anxiety. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two of them in the afterglow of honest words and new possibilities. With each step to her car, she felt her internal landscape shifting, as if she were walking toward a new identity, one that embraced vulnerability and collaboration rather than solitary struggle. That night, she updated her journal, noting every possible scenario in detail. The simple act of writing down her fears and hopes made them feel more manageable. She realized that her sense of self was already changing. Where once she had felt bound by duty and overshadowed by her mother's medical battles, she now saw a future shaped by her own choices. The question was how to move from these abstract plans to tangible reality without losing everything she cared about. 2 days later, Susan found herself once again at Betty's bungalow, the centerpiece of a small gathering that included Hannah, Michael Reeves, and Aaron. They settled around Betty's wooden dining table as the late afternoon sunlight filtered through floral curtains. A pitcher of iced tea and a plate of homemade cookies sat in the center. The mood was at once tense and expectant, like storm clouds gathering at the horizon. Betty began with her usual directness. "All right, let's lay everything out. Susan, how's your mother's situation?" Susan glanced at Aaron before replying. "Her surgery is scheduled for next week. Thanks to Marjorie at that non-profit, the deposit is smaller, but it's still more than I can afford on my own. Aaron has offered to help cover the remainder." Michael leaned forward. "And you're comfortable with that arrangement?" Susan hesitated, feeling her cheeks warm. "I'm coming to terms with it. We're discussing a formal agreement that ensures he's not just gifting me money, but potentially investing in my future cafe." "That's where I'd like your legal guidance." Michael nodded, pulling out a notepad. "Of course, we'll make it clear how much is invested, how the returns are divided, and what happens if one party wants out. And if you choose to keep your job at the Sunrise Café for a few months while your mum recovers, that's your call." Aaron cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "I'd like to see Susan free to start her own business sooner rather than later, but I understand she has responsibilities. I'm prepared to be patient." Hannah reached over, giving Susan a quick squeeze on the arm. "I know it's scary, but you have a whole team ready to help. If you do decide to go through with it, you won't be alone." Betty stirred her iced tea, observing them all. "This is a big step, Susan. But remember, if you stay at the Sunrise Café with Norman, that's also a decision. You're at a crossroads, dear." Susan's heart pounded, but she maintained a level voice. "I've thought a lot about it. If Aaron covers the surgery deposit, I won't be obligated to sign the year-long commitment with Norman just for the raise. I can still work there short-term, but with an exit strategy in place." Aaron turned to Betty. "Once Catherine is stable, how quickly can we move on, setting up a new cafe? I'm guessing we'll need at least a couple months to find the right location and handle permits." Betty nodded thoughtfully. "At least that long, maybe more if renovations are required, but we can start scouting locations right away. I'll give you a list of the realtors I trust in town." Michael jotted down notes. "We'll also need a formal business plan to attract any additional loans or grants. Investors often like to see a comprehensive outline. Susan, do you have anything prepared?" She lifted her chin. "I've been working on a rough draft with Betty's and Hannah's help. It's not polished, but it covers the main points: concept, target market, estimated expenses. I can refine it." A current of anticipation swirled around the table. Susan felt her pulse quicken at how close they were to making this real. But she also recognized there was no going back once she accepted Aaron's help. She risked entangling finances and personal feelings in a way that could complicate both her career and her relationship. Before they could delve deeper, a knock sounded at the door. Betty, frowning slightly, went to answer. Norman stood on the porch, holding an envelope and looking mildly uncomfortable to be there. He peered into the house, spotting the small group. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, voice clipped. "I was trying to reach Susan. She wasn't at the cafe." Susan exchanged a quick, tense look with the others before getting up. She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her, heart hammering. "Mr. Miller, is something wrong?" He offered the envelope. "This is the contract for your raise. I expected you to sign it this morning." She took the envelope but didn't open it. "I'm still considering my options. My mother's situation changed and—" He cut her off, frustration evident in his expression. "Susan, the Sunrise Café needs consistent staff. If you're not going to commit, say so. I'm prepared to hire someone else." Her stomach twisted. She realized Norman wasn't bluffing. The cafe's finances were precarious, and a dedicated worker was vital to keep everything afloat. Yet Susan now had a real alternative. She thought of Aaron's promise, The possibility of standing on her own in just a matter of months. Taking a breath, she squared her shoulders. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Miller, but I can't sign it. I'm sorry." A cloud of annoyance passed over Norman's face, but she also glimpsed what looked like resignation. "Well, if that's your choice, I'll adjust the schedule accordingly. You can keep your current wage. But don't expect me to guarantee extra hours when things are slow." She nodded. "Understood. I'll try not to inconvenience the cafe. We'll figure out a transition plan." Norman tucked his hands in his pockets, then gave her a curt nod before descending the porch steps. Susan watched him go, exhaling shakily. She realized she had just severed one safety net. Rejecting the raise meant losing a layer of financial security, and yet an undercurrent of relief coursed through her. Returning inside, she found everyone looking at her expectantly. Swallowing the tightness in her throat, she held up the unopened envelope. "I didn't sign. I can't. If I'm going to give this new path a real shot, I need the freedom to leave on my own terms." Betty offered a proud smile, her eyes bright. Aaron's expression blended admiration with resolve, while Hannah quietly squeezed Susan's hand. Susan realized she had taken a pivotal step, placing her faith in this fragile coalition of friends and the possibility that Aaron's financial windfall could indeed open doors she'd once believed shut. The following day, Susan woke to a sense of determination that coursed through her like fresh coffee. With Norman's contract rejected, there was no turning back. Soon she'd have to hand in her notice at Sunrise Café entirely. The final deposit for Catherine's surgery was due in 48 hours. True to his word, Aaron had transferred the agreed amount to Susan's account that morning. Seeing the updated balance in her bank app left her both grateful and profoundly anxious. Despite the new financial cushioning, she still clocked in for her usual shift at the Sunrise Café. She owed it to Betty and to the customers she'd grown fond of to finish out her remaining days with care. The air felt tense, though Norman was more distant than ever, barely speaking except to bark instructions about the day's specials or supply restocking. Hannah did her best to lighten the mood, whispering small jokes in Susan's ear, but even she couldn't dispel the charged atmosphere. Shortly before lunchtime, a familiar face appeared at the doorway. Mrs. Robinson, the elderly widow who had known Susan since she was a child. She sat at her usual table, crooking a finger to beckon Susan over. Susan forced a smile, approaching with a pot of coffee in hand. "How are you today, Mrs. Robinson?" she asked gently. The older woman tilted her head, scrutinizing Susan's tired eyes. "I've been better. My arthritis is acting up, but never mind me, dear. Tell me why you look like you're carrying the weight of the world." It was a question Susan couldn't easily evade. With surprising candor, she admitted, "A lot's changing. I might be leaving the Sunrise Café soon." Mrs. Robinson's eyes widened in mild alarm. "But you've always been such a comforting presence here." Susan's heart squeezed. "It's just time for me to take a new step. I'm not abandoning anyone, I promise." She filled Mrs. Robinson's cup, then hurried off to tend other tables before emotion got the best of her. Nevertheless, the exchange reaffirmed that leaving wasn't easy. She had built real connections here. Yet it also strengthened her resolve. People like Mrs. Robinson deserved a welcoming place to gather, whether it was at the Sunrise Café under Norman's watch, or at a new establishment that Susan might shape in her own image. That evening, after locking up, Susan found Norman waiting by the door. She expected anger or reproach, but instead he handed her the day's receipts to count. "Since you're still on the payroll until you give formal notice, do your final tasks properly," he muttered. She took the receipts and quietly proceeded to the back office, focusing on the small details of currency and credit slips. Her mind wandered to the bigger picture. Catherine's deposit would be paid tomorrow, and the surgery date was set for next week. After that, everything hinged on Catherine's recovery, and the precarious steps Susan would take toward establishing her own cafe. A flutter of nerves tightened her throat, but she willed herself to keep going. By the time she emerged, Norman had already left, leaving behind a terse note. "Keep track of any shortages. Turn in your notice when ready." She stuffed the note into her apron pocket, feeling a tinge of sadness at how their working relationship had dissolved. Still, she reminded herself that her path lay elsewhere now. Outside, Aaron waited in his car. She slipped into the passenger seat, exhaling deeply. "Thanks for picking me up." He gave her a reassuring grin. "No problem. How was the day?" She shook her head. "Strained, but it's done. I'm off tomorrow so I can help Mom with last-minute surgery prep. And I'll make the payment." She glanced at him, voice quavering slightly. "I appreciate you for doing this." "I really do." Aaron reached over and squeezed her hand. "We'll get through it." He navigated the quiet streets toward Susan's home. As they neared the small green cottage, she gazed out the window at the swaying trees under the moonlit sky, feeling the weight of the upcoming surgery press down on her. What if complications arose? What if Catherine's recovery took months longer than anticipated? The uncertainty gnawed at her. Once they pulled into the driveway, Aaron cut the engine. Before she could exit the car, he turned to her. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. You know that, right?" She rested her head against the seat, swallowing back a surge of emotion. "I don't always feel it," he let out a soft laugh. "Neither do I, but here we are." They sat in silence for a moment, the calm of the night providing a sanctuary for unspoken fears and hopes. At length, Susan opened the door. "I'll see you soon." Aaron nodded, watching as she stepped outside, the porch light illuminating her weary figure. "Call me if you need anything, day or night." Inside, Catherine greeted Susan from the couch with a fragile smile. They discussed the final preparations, the paperwork, the schedule, the overnight hospital stay. Susan assured her mother the deposit was taken care of, though she didn't elaborate on the source. Catherine simply held her daughter's hand, gratitude shining in her tired eyes. That night, as Susan climbed into bed, her nerves danced between dread and relief. In less than 24 hours, she would pay the hospital and free her mother to have the surgery. She clung to the faith that Catherine would pull through, and once Catherine's health was on a surer footing, Susan would finally be able to pursue a future shaped by her own convictions. She had come face to face with her greatest fear, relying on others. Yet in doing so, she discovered a deeper strength in unity and compassion. The real test lay just around the corner, but she felt ready to meet it with her eyes open and her heart set on building something not just for herself, but for everyone she cared about. The morning of Catherine's surgery arrived, bringing with it a clear sky that felt like a promise of better things ahead. Susan woke at dawn, her heart fluttering as she checked and rechecked the hospital bag she'd packed the night before. Inside, it were comfortable clothes for Catherine, a few of her favorite tea bags, and an old photograph Susan knew would offer emotional support, a picture of the two of them, smiling warmly at a past birthday celebration. Despite her best efforts at calm, Susan couldn't ignore the tight coil of anxiety in her stomach. When she walked into the living room, she found Catherine dressed and sitting quietly on the couch, gaze focused on the family portrait on the wall. Susan offered a gentle hug, and Catherine sighed. "Ready?" Susan asked softly. "As I'll ever be," Catherine replied, voice trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Let's do this. It's time to move forward." They stepped outside to find Aaron already waiting by his car. A crisp, cool breeze ruffled the edges of his jacket as he hurried over to help Catherine into the back seat. He offered Susan a reassuring smile, though he looked almost as tense as she felt. In the passenger seat, Susan clasped her hands together, silently grateful for his presence. The drive to Winchester Medical Center was mostly quiet. Radio static filled occasional attempts at conversation, but each passing mile brought them closer to the operating room and the uncertain outcome that awaited. By the time they arrived, Susan noticed her palms were clammy. She took a deep breath as Aaron parked near the entrance. A nurse greeted them inside, guiding Catherine into a pre-op room. Tests and vitals came next, a blur of medical jargon and white lab coats that left Susan feeling helpless. Finally, a soft-spoken anesthesiologist appeared, gently explaining the procedure and what Catherine would experience. Catherine nodded, face pale but determined. When it was time to wheel her away, Catherine motioned for Susan to lean in. She whispered, "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. Live your life, Susan. Don't wait for perfect conditions." Tears threatened to blur Susan's vision, but she managed a tight smile. "I will, Mom. I promise." She placed a kiss on Catherine's forehead, then watched with a pounding heart as her mother disappeared behind swinging double doors. Aaron led Susan to a waiting lounge where plastic chairs lined the walls and a TV in the corner played a daytime talk show at low volume. Most seats were empty, providing a quiet setting that only seemed to heighten the tension. He guided her to a corner chair and handed her a cup of water from the vending machine area. "You okay?" he asked softly, sitting beside her. She swallowed hard. "I'm not sure how to feel, just hoping for the best." He nodded, taking her hand gently. They waited in silence for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall barely moved. Eventually, the nurse came by with an update. Catherine was stable under anesthesia, and the surgical team had begun their work. Relief mingled with renewed apprehension in Susan's chest. So much could still go wrong. Betty arrived not long after day, armed with a thermos of tea and a gentle smile. She pressed the thermos into Susan's hands. "Chamomile," she whispered. "Figured you could use something calming." Susan took a small sip, grateful for the warmth spreading through her. Hannah joined them soon afterward, slipping into a plastic chair with her own anxious expression. One by one, familiar faces from the cafe drifted in, offering words of comfort. Mrs. Robinson even appeared, slowly making her way down the corridor with a cane. She patted Susan's arm and said, "Just wanted you to know I'm praying for you both." Though Susan appreciated their support, her mind kept returning to the thought of her mother under surgical lights, doctors working tirelessly to repair what was broken. She'd done everything she could, arranged finances, found help, set aside her dream just enough to ensure Catherine's well-being. Now all that was left was faith. The hours dragged on, each minute punctuated by the whir of the waiting room vending machine and the quiet hum of overhead fluorescents. Occasionally, one of the staff would pass by with an update that amounted to little more than no change yet. Aaron held Susan's hand the entire time, and though neither spoke much, his presence was a comfort she clung to. Finally, close to midday, a surgeon emerged through the double doors, still dressed in scrubs. Spotting the small group, he approached with a neutral expression. Susan rose so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and her mouth felt dry. "Is she okay?" she managed, voice trembling. The surgeon's demeanor eased into a reassuring look. "Your mother is out of surgery and stable. We did a bypass that appears successful, but she'll need careful monitoring in the ICU. The next 24 hours are critical." Susan's knees threatened to buckle in relief as she let out a shaky breath. Aaron braced her, with a steadying hand on her arm. Across the waiting room, Betty and Hannah exchanged hopeful smiles, and Mrs. Robinson closed her eyes in silent thanks. Though there was still a journey ahead, recovery, rehabilitation, the looming question of how Catherine would cope post-surgery, this moment felt like the first clear sunrise after a stormy night. Susan clutched Aaron's hand, tears of exhaustion and gratitude brimming in her eyes, determined to face whatever came next with the same tenacity that had gotten them here. Catherine spent 3 full days in the ICU under close observation. To Susan's enormous relief, her mother's heart responded well to the surgery, though she remained weak and drowsy from medication. Each day, Susan would arrive early at the hospital, bringing small comforts, a new magazine, a playlist of soothing music, or a fresh bouquet of carnations to brighten the sterile room. When Catherine finally moved to a regular recovery ward, her spirits lifted. She still tired easily, drifting in and out of rest, but she could hold a short conversation without labored breathing. On the 5th day, the doctor cleared her to sit by the window, and she pointed out the view of Winchester's old brick buildings and the green slopes beyond. "I never realized how pretty it looks from this angle," Catherine mused, her voice hushed. Susan gave a soft laugh, rolling the wheeled IV stand closer so her mother didn't feel tethered. "Sometimes it takes a new perspective to appreciate what's always been right there." During one such visit, Aaron appeared with a small gift bag. Catherine eyed him curiously, and he handed it over with a sheepish grin. "Just something to keep you occupied," he said. Inside were puzzle books, crosswords, Sudoku, and a lightweight scarf with a delicate floral pattern. Catherine smiled, pressing the scarf gently against her cheek. "Thank you, Aaron." "You didn't have to." He shrugged, visibly relieved that she seemed pleased. "It's the least I can do after everything Susan's done for me." Catherine glanced at her daughter, nodding with a warmth in her eyes. She seemed to recognize that an unspoken bond had solidified between them all. Later, as Susan and Aaron stepped out to give Catherine some rest, they found themselves in a sun-dappled hospital courtyard. The mild weather coaxed out the scent of nearby flower beds, a surprising oasis amid the clamor of medical routines. "So," Aaron began, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets, "with your mom improving, have you given any more thought to the Café plan?" Susan bit her lower lip. "All the time. I've been in touch with Betty and Hannah. They're scouting locations. Michael's drawing up some preliminary investment papers. It's all so surreal. I haven't actually quit the Sunrise Café yet, but I'm planning to give official notice soon." He nodded. "I know how big a leap this is. I'm behind you, whatever you decide. No pressure." She touched his arm lightly, appreciating the sensitivity in his tone. "I do want this," she admitted, "but I also worry about juggling Mom's recovery. She'll probably need me for weeks, maybe months, before she's truly independent again." Aaron's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe it doesn't have to be immediate. You can use the next few weeks to line everything up, permits, financing, concept details, so that when you're ready, you can move forward without rushing." The logic soothed some of her anxious thoughts. "That sounds reasonable," she said. "I'm just not used to everything working out so smoothly." He chuckled. "That's understandable, given what we've been through. But if it helps, I'm also not used to life cooperating." "Feels pretty strange, right?" They shared a moment of silent understanding, letting the sunlight and the gentle chatter of passers-by fill the air between them. Eventually, they returned to Catherine's room, where she had dozed off. The nurse assured them she was stable, so Aaron headed out for his warehouse shift, and Susan stayed behind to read quietly in the chair by Catherine's bed. Over the next week, Catherine's energy steadily rose. She could walk short distances with a physical therapist, do gentle stretches, and even engage in longer conversations. The hospital finally gave a discharge date, instructing Susan on medications, diet, and follow-up appointments. The day Catherine was released felt like an odd mix of triumph and responsibility. Susan gently guided her mother into Aaron's car, loaded the trunk with the bag of puzzle books and new prescriptions, then settled in the back seat to keep an eye on her. Catherine gazed out the window, almost childlike in her renewed wonder at everyday sights, the local bakery, the bus stop, the fountain in the town square. Back at the green cottage, Susan helped Catherine navigate the front steps. Inside, Hannah had tidied the living room, laying fresh sheets on the couch in case Catherine preferred to rest there. A few get-well-soon balloons bobbed in the corner, courtesy of Betty and a handful of Sunrise Café regulars. Catherine lowered herself onto the couch, breathing slowly but surely. Susan noticed the improvement in her mother's posture. Less slumped, more hopeful. A sense of relief flooded her, but also a realization. The next phase of life was about to begin. Catherine might still need her, but the crisis was passing. This meant Susan had no more excuses to delay or defer her dreams. Before heading home for the night, Aaron lingered in the doorway, giving Susan a brief, meaningful smile. Neither spoke, but she understood his message. It was time to look to the future. Her mother was on the mend. The obstacles they'd feared most had been faced. Now, could she truly embrace the changes she'd been planning all along? The quiet days that followed Catherine's return home brought a gradual rhythm of recovery. Each morning, Susan helped her mother prepare a simple breakfast, often oatmeal or scrambled eggs, and then guided her through gentle exercises recommended by the physical therapist. Catherine's stamina improved in small increments, but each tiny victory felt monumental. One rainy afternoon, Susan found herself in the kitchen, sorting through a stack of postcards Betty had dropped off. They showcased available properties in Winchester, mostly modest spaces near downtown. Each photo stirred a flutter of both excitement and nerves. Betty had scribbled notes on the backs, describing square footage, approximate rent, and her personal impressions. Catherine, seated at the kitchen table, caught sight of the postcards. "So, which one looks most promising?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Susan laid them out. "Betty really likes this old storefront near the park. It's not huge, but it has charm. I'm supposed to see it in person with Hannah next week." She hesitated, glancing at her mother. "But only if you're sure you'll be okay for a few hours on your own." Catherine waved off the concern with a gentle laugh. "Go. I can manage. Just keep my phone nearby in case I need to reach you." It felt surreal. Mere weeks ago, Catherine had been in a hospital bed, and Susan had been on the verge of sacrificing her dream altogether. Now, they were making plans for her to scout a location for her own cafe. There was still a note of caution in her mother's eyes, but also genuine support that hadn't been there before. That evening, Aaron stopped by with a few groceries. He'd taken to swinging by after his warehouse shift, bringing small treats like fresh fruit or granola bars, which Catherine was permitted to eat under her new health regime. As they unpacked the bags in the kitchen, Susan showed him the postcards. He studied them with interest. "I like this one," he said, pointing to an image of a cozy brick building with wide front windows. "Betty wrote that it used to be a bakery decades ago, so maybe it's even got some existing fixtures." Susan nodded. She thinks the plumbing and electrical might need updating, but it could be a hidden gem. Aaron's eyes flicked toward Catherine, who was reading in the living room. Then he leaned closer to Susan. "We should probably talk soon about the financial side. Michael told me he's almost finished drafting a partnership agreement." "I want to make sure we're both comfortable with the terms," Susan swallowed, remembering her earlier apprehensions. "Right, we should, maybe in a few days, once I've seen the space." He reached for her hand, giving it a light squeeze. "No rush. I'm just eager to see you in your own element, running the place you've dreamed of for so long." Later that night, after Aaron had gone, Susan mulled over the partnership idea. Accepting his investment felt less terrifying now that Catherine was recovering. She sensed a quiet shift in her own mindset. She was ready to build something lasting, not just for herself, but as a testament to the kindness and resilience that had carried them this far. A couple of days passed, and Susan returned to the Sunrise Café for what she assumed might be her final week of shifts. Norman barely acknowledged her, instructing her to focus on the afternoon crowd. It stung, but she'd made her peace with his disapproval. Betty, on the other hand, lit up the moment Susan stepped in, pulling her aside to discuss the vacant storefront near the park. They huddled by the pastry display as Betty rattled off her findings. The owner lives out of state. He's older, which might mean he's more open to a fair deal, especially if he wants reliable tenants. Susan found herself smiling. It's hard to believe this is happening. I was so certain I'd have to give it all up. Betty's gaze softened. You're a living example of how one kind act can spark a chain of events you never see coming. Aaron's willingness to help speaks volumes about both of you. The day wore on, filled with familiar routines of serving customers and tidying tables. By closing time, Susan felt a tug of nostalgia. She might miss the cafe, despite all the strife with Norman. After wiping down the last table, she stepped outside, inhaling the fresh evening air. Across the street, she spotted Hannah waving, her coat pulled tight against the wind. They met on the sidewalk, and Hannah looped an arm through Susan's. Walk with me for a bit. They strolled through Winchester's quiet streets, passing shuttered shops and dimly lit windows. Hannah asked how Catherine was faring, and Susan gave updates on her improving health. Then their conversation drifted to the new cafe dream. Hannah was already planning her role, maybe as a manager or head barista. You know, Hannah said, grinning, I've got this wild idea for pastries that feature local berries in every season. We could rotate them throughout the year. Susan laughed, imagining the possibilities. That sounds perfect. Let's keep brainstorming. Eventually they parted ways, and Susan walked the final block to her house alone. The warmth of anticipation coursed through her. Everything was aligning, slowly but surely. Yet she reminded herself that building a new cafe was more than a dream. It was a responsibility. If she did this, she wanted to honor the generosity Aaron had shown, the friendship Hannah and Betty provided, and the unwavering love from her mother. Each day, she planted more seeds of transformation, hoping to see them blossom into a place where kindness, community, and good coffee would thrive for years to come. The weekend arrived, bringing Susan's much-anticipated appointment to view the brick storefront near the park. Morning light glimmered on wet pavement as she, Hannah, and Betty pulled up to the building. It stood on a quiet street lined with oak trees, leaves rustling in a soft breeze. An older man with a friendly smile greeted them on the sidewalk, introducing himself as Roy Kendall, the property owner. Inside, the space felt worn but full of potential. A wide window spanned the front, allowing sunlight to pool on the wooden floorboards. Dust motes danced in the rays of light, and old baking equipment lay in a corner, covered in tarps. The smell of lingering flour, nostalgia, and the faint promise of fresh coffee seemed to permeate the air. Hannah circled the room, muttering her excitement about the open layout. Betty tapped walls and checked for structural soundness, nodding approvingly. Roy offered them a tour of the back area, a small kitchen with a wall of industrial sinks and a separate storage room that could double as a pantry. It needs some TLC, Roy admitted, but it's got good bones. Susan felt her heart lift. A wave of recognition washed over her, as though this place had been waiting for her. She glanced at Betty, who gave a discreet thumbs up, and Hannah, whose eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. After a final walkthrough, they reconvened near the front window. So, Roy said, I heard you might be interested in leasing. I'm open to negotiation if you're serious. Susan pressed her palms together, inhaling the dust-tinged air. I am serious. I believe this could be a wonderful cafe if we make the right renovations. They discussed rent figures, length of the lease, and potential clauses. Betty took notes, promising to pass them along to Michael Reeves for review. By the time they wrapped up, Roy appeared more than willing to come to terms that suited both sides. Outside, Hannah nearly bounced on her toes. "Susan, this is it. This is our place." "I can already imagine people lined up for coffee and pastries," Betty chuckled, placing a supportive hand on Susan's shoulder. "I have a good feeling about this." That evening, Susan hurried home to share the news with Catherine. She found her mother resting in the recliner, watching a rerun of an old sitcom. Catherine muted the TV as soon as Susan entered. "How did it go?" she asked, eyebrows arched in anticipation. Susan launched into a detailed description of the building, the potential layout, and Roy's openness to a fair lease. She finished with a breathless smile. "I feel like it could really work, Mom." Catherine's eyes glistened with pride. "I know it will. You've always had a gift for seeing potential." Over the next few days, Susan's life became a whirlwind of meetings with Michael to finalize the partnership terms with Aaron, talking to Roy about small renovations, and officially giving her resignation at the Sunrise Café. She stood by Norman's office door, notice in hand, unsure how he would respond. He accepted the envelope, scanning it with a neutral expression. "So that's it," he said quietly. "You're leaving?" She nodded. "I appreciate the opportunity you gave me here, Mr. Miller, but it's time for me to move on." For a moment, he looked as if he wanted to argue, but then he sighed. "Well, I suppose you're chasing bigger things. Good luck, Susan." On her last day, she served Mrs. Robinson a final cup of coffee, tears threatening to spill. The elderly widow clutched Susan's hand gently. "I'll miss you here, dear, but I'll be sure to visit your new place." Betty gave Susan a brief hug in the kitchen, whispering, "This isn't a goodbye, it's a graduation." That sentiment carried Susan through the week. By Friday, she and Aaron met at Michael's small law office, a converted historic house near the heart of Winchester. Papers lay neatly on the polished wooden table, waiting for their signatures. Michael walked them through every clause, how Aaron's investment would be protected, how Susan's ownership share would be structured, and how they would handle profits. Susan held the pen, heart thumping as she glanced at Aaron. He smiled encouragingly, leaning in to sign his name first. Then, with a final rush of breath, Susan put her signature on the dotted line. A sense of nervous exhilaration rushed through her veins. Outside, they stood on the front porch of the law office, the evening sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Aaron slipped an arm around her shoulders. "It's official now," he said, grin wide. She let out a breathless laugh, leaning into him. "Yeah, it is. I can't believe it." His voice turned quiet, touched with emotion. "Believe it. You've come so far. We both have." They lingered a moment, simply absorbing the significance of this step. The path hadn't been easy. Financial strain, Catherine's health scare, letting go of a stable job. Yet every hardship had led them here, to this brink of creation. That weekend, Susan held a small gathering at home to celebrate. Catherine, still regaining strength, beamed with maternal pride from her seat. Betty offered toast after toast, while Hannah teased Susan about her future as a coffee mogul. Aaron stayed at Susan's side, sometimes looking lost in his own gratitude at how life had transformed. Late that night, after everyone had gone, Susan sat alone by the living room window, a cup of chamomile in hand. The moonlight cast silver lines across the floor, and she thought of all the changes still to come. Renovating the storefront, naming the new cafe, hiring staff, and opening the doors to a community she wanted to serve with warmth and generosity. In that quiet moment, she closed her eyes and exhaled. She felt ready, renewed by the trials she'd overcome and the people who had stood with her. For the first time in a long while, she believed that the shape of her future was entirely within her grasp. Her heart thudded with anticipation, convinced that this new beginning could blossom into something truly extraordinary. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.